So our next presentation is Monica Monalescu. She's a professor of American literature at the University of Strasbourg and a junior member of the Institut Universitaire de France. She has been a visiting scholar at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, an honorary research fellow at the University of Kent, and a visiting professor at the ICU Tokyo, and cartographies of New York and other post-war American cities, art, literature, and urban spaces in 2018.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tatiana. So I'm a literary scholar, and contrary to Roger, we are severely underfunded. We're also useless, as everybody knows, but we think we are indispensable for all of us to enjoy the beauty of the world, right? Let me start with an anecdote. My first personal contact with Newton happened last year, and it was placed under the sign of generosity. I emailed Newton to say that I was writing an article on the lagoon cycle, and I was editing with two other colleagues from Strasbourg an issue of this academic journal we have at the English department in Strasbourg, RANAM, Recherche Anglaise et Nord-Américaine, on landscapes and aesthetic spatialities in the Anthropocene. And Newton very generously allowed us to use an image of the lagoon cycle on the cover and 3 other images from the lagoon cycle for inclusion in my article for free. And I can confidently say that no other cover of the journal has received so much attention and praise. I sent Newton copies of the journal, and he replied in a long email expressing his enthusiasm and saying that he hoped we would be able to continue the conversation. And of course, this is what we're doing now. I am very grateful, honored, and delighted to be here, part of this conversation. And of course, conversation is what Newton does and has been doing so brilliantly with Helen in their work over 5 decades. Now, given the fact that the lagoon cycle has been kept in storage at the Centre Pompidou since 1995, I think, unfortunately, or earlier even, I felt that symbolically and very modestly, I was bringing it back to light in France, thanks to my article and this journal issue. Now, generosity is the key word in this story, and generosity is an important term in my paper today. Not only Newton's generosity as an artist in dialogue with me, in dialogue with us researchers, but I would say Newton's generosity in his art. I would say that Newton and Helen's art is an art of generosity. Generosity in dialogue with the world and the human and more than human communities that inhabit it. Now, my talk today will address the question of authorship and agency in Helen and Newton's work. As I've said, I'm a literary scholar who's interested also in art, and I work on the hybridity of artistic forms and discourses. And what I would like to bring to our discussion today is a reflection on the ways in which stories, discourses, texts, voices, words, the way in which they shape agency and incite or invite performance, and they create an art of doing things with words. Now, this is a very famous title from linguistics, from Austin, How to Do Things with Words. It's a book in which he talked about performative verbs that actually do something. And I would like to say that what Newton and Helen have been doing is an art of doing things with words and with other media, of course. And I would also like to call it an art of generosity, and I will try to conceptualize this term of generosity, what it means. So I would like to argue that generosity is a defining trait of Newton as a person, but also the models of authorship and agency that he has shaped with Helen Mayer Harrison. Now, the idea of art as a gift offered out of disinterested generosity by a generous artist takes various forms in philosophical and artistic and literary discourses. And the most common perspective on generosity is philosophical and religious. We think about generosity in terms of giving, gift-making, philanthropy, and the virtue of donating. But the aesthetic perspective is less common, the aesthetic perspective on generosity. What does it mean for art to be generous? And it would be fascinating, I think, to write a history of the literary and artistic forms of generosity, retracing their meanings from Kant's disinterestedness to contemporary practices of collective participation. Now, I'm a literary scholar, as I said, and there's a huge emphasis on generosity in the discourses of modernism, of literary modernism in particular. And they reverberate in postmodernism and in contemporary literature. And I would like to give you a few quite famous examples of what authors understood by generosity within this paradigm of modernism. James Joyce, for instance, famously stated that his fiction was meant to keep the reader busy for a lifetime. And this is an ambivalent statement. Indeed. This is an ambivalent statement suggesting both a generous gift, but also an expectation of hard work from the reader, who should devote his whole life to decoding Joyce's works. And generosity is answered by arduous toil over carefully crafted sentences, over very dense, elusive intertextual references. And this kind of toil, this is exactly what we do as literary scholars. And this is what I did, for instance, in my PhD on also on a modernist writer, but a later modernist, Vladimir Nabokov, on his American fiction. And he also is a writer considered to be generous by critics. His biographer, Brian Boyd, calls Nabokov a generous author from the perspective of the interpreter. Why? Because the generous author gives the reader all the keys she needs to decode his work. So writers give bountifully and readers take generously, gratefully, but the reward comes at the expense of time, effort, and insomnia. Now, I'm not making insomnia up. Insomnia is a keyword from Joyce. Joyce said that his fiction was meant for the ideal reader suffering from an ideal insomnia. And again, there's a lot to uncover from these remarks, and above all, a certain take on individual genius, who produces works of great intellectual sophistication and elusive density that require a lifetime of sustained hermeneutic activity from individual readers. Now, if we move on from this kind of paradigm of individual the individual author as generous in modernism, to the generosity underlying Newton and Helen's practice of authorship, these two are very different, because Helen and Newton's practice of authorship can be defined, I think, thanks to a political and temporal understanding of generosity that we find in Albert Camus. It's a very famous definition of generosity that has made a comeback recently in various contemporary discussions from The Rebel, L'Homme Révolté, a book published in 1951, where he defines generosity very famously as the true generosity towards the future lies in giving all to the present. So The Rebel is a historical and philosophical essay written in the wake of World War II, which posits rebellion. We've talked about indignation this morning, but it's actually very similar. Rebellion against unjust contexts and authorities as a superior form of attitude, which raises the individual to solidarity and to meaningfulness. And as Camus sees it, the rebel gives all to the present, and thus demonstrates generosity towards the future. And of course, there's a shift from Camus' humanism to Helen and Newton's more than humanism. But what remains, I think, in a very important way, is an articulation between generosity and temporality, generosity and time, generosity and present and future. Now, this presence of time, of temporality, is very important in Newton and Helen's art. This is an art that's committed to the vulnerability and the urgency of the present, an art that is interested in undoing the patterns of destruction that we've inherited from the past, and in thinking of how to activate relevant counterforces for the future, for the benefit of the future. And of course, these three temporalities cannot be disentangled. They're interconnected. Because the present is never an interstitial moment that's frozen between past and future. Rather, the present can be seen as continuous flowing time that links several historical perspectives. And there's a very interesting quote from Gertrude Stein from Composition as Explanation, where she says, "I made almost 1,000 pages of a continuous present." And I think this is a very interesting quote, because the same can be said about Helen and Newton. The monumental catalogue of the time of the force majeure contains not 1,000 but 500 pages of continuous present in dialogue with past and future narratives. And I thought it was very interesting earlier when I think it was Anne and Chris who talked about how long is now. I think this is exactly it. How long is now? This idea of the continuous present. Now, in this case, in the case of the Harrisons, generosity is defined in larger than individual categories. It's entangled in history and in context. And ultimately, generosity is an ethics of being in the here and now, but it grows into an ethics of the future and an ethics for the future. An art that gives all to the present, imagines constructive possibilities for the future. And authorship is implicitly redefined as agency. Creating is sharing and acting. And I would like to quote a sentence that was that we heard earlier today. It's at the beginning of the time of the force majeure from Making Earth, and Newton says, "It was 1970, Earth Day had happened. I was becoming ecologically aware and had made the decision that I would do only work that benefited the ecosystem in some way." End of quote. And this ecological generosity is grounded in history, and I think temporality is very, very important, this idea of an art of generosity. Because all of the projects developed by Helen and Newton around the world show an awareness in time and history, from the long temporality of evolution to recent historical events. Of course, doing field work and preliminary research to unveil the layers of history, the history of a given place. These are important procedures among post-war American artists, and they are particularly important in land art, where the site and the history of the site becomes really prominent. And for Helen and Newton, entropy is not abstract duration. Rather, it is materialized in historical and evolutionary contingencies. And there are many, many examples in all of their projects of the ways in which history is actually materialized and is taken into account. And just to give you a few examples, in Portable Orchard, the citrus orchard is, quote, this is very beautiful, "a lost whisper from the past, barely perceptible in the face of endless development." Or in the lagoon cycle, of course, as we know in the part about the history of Sri Lanka, where we have these voices, dissonant voices, that discuss the history of Sri Lanka. Also, other examples in Fortress Atlanta, where the history of civil rights stands at the heart of the project, or in Dreaming the Yarkon River Alive, where the history of the river is so important in the documentation of the project, from King Herod to 1989. Similarly, in Topography of Terror, Berlin is shaped by World War II, by the Cold War, and the Harrisons insist on the fact that their project tried not to sanitize the past. And their manifesto for the 21st century opens with a series of historical inflections that take us from Gilgamesh to today. We of the force majeure believe that a series of events have come into being, beginning in the time of Gilgamesh and before, beginning with agriculture and genetic manipulation, beginning with culturing of animals and ongoing genetic manipulation, beginning with globalization 6,000 years ago with the salt route, a little later the Silk Route. So Newton and Helen's commitment to the present as an ethics for the future is best exemplified by the Force Majeure Manifesto, which is an ecological and political invitation to understand the extreme pressure of human agency on ecosystems and to act accordingly. Now, an important question would be the following. If Helen and Newton create an art of giving, what is expected in return? And I think the title of your talk tomorrow is Giving More Than We Take. So I think this is extremely important in this idea of art of generosity and the relationship to time. How much we give, what do we expect, and what do we take? Now, Joyce, as I said, expected the reader's insomnia, a lifetime deciphering literary hermeneutics. But here, I think, in the case of Helen and Newton, the ideal objective would be a change of paradigm, a change of attitude from indifference to attention, from lack of care to care, and also from the individual to the communal and the systemic. The agency of art, its political outreach, its ramifications into the world, these are closely articulated with the agency of the viewer and reader. Actually, the two cannot be dissociated, the agency of the artist and our agency as audience. We are invited to engage and to react. And this brings me to an important series of questions. What are the Harrison's means of persuasion? Of course, there are many of them. How is their message taken across and actively reverberated? How is generosity expressed? The question of the medium is, I think, very important. And these questions address the efficiency of art, a complicated question, the efficiency of art, its ramifications into politics, also its power to solicit a reaction in a combined aesthetic political reception. And of course, we can start from the very simple observation that many of Helen and Newton's projects, urban projects or reclamation projects, have been implemented in collaboration with political authorities and administrators, with governors, with mayors, with urban planners. And there's a very funny moment in the Castle works where Newton and Helen remember how the president of the Federal Republic of Germany and former mayor of Berlin, Richard von Weizsäcker, stopped to admire their work, praise their insight, and invite them to Berlin, where they did go later. While the curator, Manfred Schneckenberger, who disliked the project, was trying to pull the president away and rush him through their section. And I think this is very, very interesting. I think this dual reaction of appreciation from some, reticence from others. I think this is often mentioned actually in your memories of how the various works were received. And I think that this shows something. It shows that your work has the power to draw the reader and viewer into conversation, either consensual or polemical. Of course, while itself, this art is a complex form of conversation, as has already been shown by Grant Kester, among others. And now I would like to address a specific form of expression that's really typical of Helen and Newton, which is poetry. Because among the authorial persona that Helen and Newton have created throughout their work, there's a whole series of fluctuating frames and dynamics of authorship. We have, from the early works centered on individual performances like Making Earth, whereas there's an emphasis on the body and on the shared agency of artist and the earth. And then we move on to authorship that's more dual, like dialogue, like in the Lagoon Cycle, of course. And also, we have another example, a beautiful example in San Diego as the center of the world. We have this quote of the third artist operating in the space between us. And I really love this quote. And we're moving on to other forms of authorship, to collective rituals of sharing meals, for instance, in portable fish farms, walking in urban environments, like in Baltimore Promenade. And we also have an inclusion of more than human creatures in a collaboration with life support systems. This is a quote. And the most radical, the most revolutionary, perhaps the most interesting form of authorship we have at the end of Peninsula Europe 4, where we are urged to, quote, yield agency enforceable by law to the lives that are not ourselves, dare we say nature, or better yet, the life web. And this, of course, is in resonance with what was said earlier today about dictatorship. And I think there's an important conversation to have about this. Now, Helen and Newton, in their work, they speak as one, they speak as two, they speak as an open collective entity addressing other open collective entities, ourselves or the life web. And they're also a multiplicity of identities, people. They're artists, they're poets, they're map makers, they're researchers, historians, activists, they're psychologists, they are gardeners, they are cooks. And of course, there's something generous and polymorphic in this proliferation of identities that we have in their work. And I think that this proliferation of identities and voices responds to our own interdisciplinarity as a group, as a community of researchers here. Because I feel that whatever we study, whatever we experiment with, however specialized we might be, there's always an aspect of their projects that we can relate to intellectually or humanly. And among all of these creative identities, I would like to consider briefly their poetic persona, which I think is very interesting. It embraces performative dialogue and also collective readings. Helen and Newton have produced a vast body of written work, which is always combined with other media in very complex hybrid projects. They have experimented with a variety of discourses, scientific, literary, artistic. But among all of these, I think poetry is quite distinctive. And the aesthetic experience of their work often involves a great deal of reading from the audience. And it's funny to read in the afterstory to the Lagoon Cycle. Newton recalls the fact that, quote, the critics found it boring because of all the reading that was required. This is like my students reacting to my class. It's boring because of all the reading that was required. I'm sorry?
2 paragraphs.
Right. No, so indeed, reading does require an effort, an active intellectual stance, and poetry gives a very unique linguistic, metaphorical, material, vocal touch to the complex interaction of arts and media that is specific to Helen and Newton. Now, the poetry written and performed by Helen and Newton revisits a whole variety of traditions. It combines a whole series of strands. There's the playfulness of conceptual poetry. There's the oracular sort of cadence or phrasing of myth, of ancient prophecies, old epics as well. We find echoes of Whitman's free verse, ethnopoetics, of course. We also find the poetic inflections of certain literary manifestos, talk poems, and of course the scripted dynamic of the happenings and experimental poetry in general. All of this, I think, all of these are revisited by Helen and Newton. And I would like us to read and listen to the opening lines of Meditations on the Sacramento River, the Delta and the Bays of San Francisco, which I have chosen to honor California. And I think that in these lines, if we listen carefully, if we read them carefully, we can sense an articulation between political and ecological content on the one hand and poetic form on another. Diking, channeling, pumping, diverting the flow of the San Joaquin River at Friant and the Sacramento River at the Delta, limiting the flushing of the Delta and the bays, crisscrossing the valley with ditches and canals. They dammed all the rivers and most of the streams that flow into the Delta and the bays. They dammed the Sacramento River, the Trinity River, the McCloud River, and the Pitt River, Fall Creek, Hat Creek, Cow Creek, Stony Creek, Battle Creek, Pewter Creek, and Butte Creek. Now, if we read carefully, if we listen carefully, we can hear, I think, the repetitive thumping in the first line, the pounding of these 3 verbal forms, diking, channeling, pumping, which suggest to me the rhythmic pumping of water in their very accumulation of thumping effect. And we can also hear the pun, I think, in the damned, which is a play on dam the construction, and dam, like the interjection, and the verb suggesting condemnation and destruction. Also, very interestingly, if we just look at the material aspect of the text, the second line is longer, and it does suggest this diversion, the circumvolution of water. It becomes like a meandering line, a river of words. And I think this enumeration of river names in the last 3 lines, what it does, I think it succeeds in mapping the territory linguistically, topographically, and so we have an interplay, between the maps and the poem. Together, they do very similar things. They map the territory. And also, I think it's important that all the river names are given to us because names matter. River names matter. And the poem performs an act of care, I think, for for the complexity of the water system threatened by the politics of irrigated farming. I think that all in all, what I'm trying to show is that the poem invites us to experience the life web, but also the pressures that it undergoes. And I think that in this case, it's quite clear that political content is materialized in poetic form, and poetic form enacts the water system. We are told in Guadalupe Meander that a river is a medium for a discourse between life forms that exist in mutual support. And conversely, here, I think the text becomes a river and enacts the water system together with the pressures that bear down on it in a dual poetic and political procedure. We have the two together. One final comment about time, because again, time is very important, has to do with how this poem, the series of poems, was performed at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art in 1977. And this is a very, very interesting comment about the temporal component of performing the text. Quote, the 10 texts that made up the meditations were designed to be read in two voices, male and female. They were also designed to be read collectively in about 13 minutes, or about 1 minute, 10 seconds per image. The discipline set out to answer the question of how much information you could compress and in how short a reading time for understanding to take place of extremely complex eco-political observation, leading ultimately to the understanding that all Central Valley operations, farming, water usage, damming, were a form of extraction operating in indifference to the laws of the conservation of energy, and therefore, in the relatively short term, were self-canceling. I find this fascinating, this parallel that we have here between the reading time and the short-term horizon of agricultural operations, between the compression of information and discourse and the compression of agricultural processes, between understanding the poem as it is performed and understanding the mechanisms of extraction and depletion that are predicated on the water system. And I think that what this shows is that the possibility of agency, of acting, starts from the awareness that ethical gestures unfold in longer durations. And this is something that we've said earlier. And I think this is something that the performance shows and the poem shows as well. So ethical gestures unfold in longer durations beyond the benefits of immediate usage and production and beyond the limitations of human time, of human life. To think on larger temporal scales, which are those of our ecosystems, of trees, as we said earlier, right? Generosity is needed, the temporal generosity that gives all to the present in order for the future to flow like an unimpeded water system, like a healthy water system. The word healthy was also mentioned. And I would like to conclude by saying that I think that poetry offers us the experience of the web of life itself, including the temporal effects of the force majeure. Yet again, time appears as a central element to take into account in its large scale beyond the span of human existence. And contemporary writers such as Amitav Ghosh in The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable, and Richard Powers in The Overstory, whom I mentioned earlier, have recently pleaded for fiction and art to use larger temporal categories that would do justice to the long temporality of climate change and more than human creatures like trees. Now, if Joyce wanted the reader to spend her life deciphering his prose, Helen and Newton would prefer that we project ourselves beyond ourselves and our existence in the longer time that only generosity can make possible. Thank you. And I should have entitled my talk, An Art of Time and Generosity, but it was an experimental form of research, and I only arrived at the idea at the end. Thank you.
Okay.
Hello?
Yes?
Okay, so thank you, Monica. That was fabulous. That was really, really interesting, and certainly revealed a dimension that I don't think we'd paid attention to. and really even considered, actually. But I wanted to add another aspect of generosity, which is, I think, the last work that Helen and Newton sign is San Diego as the center of the world, and thereafter the works aren't signed. And as Newton said, that, I mean, in a way, that's a very particular thing for an artist not to sign a work, because it means other people can take it up and use it. And in a sense, it's setting aside the issue of copyright.
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting comment. I hadn't thought about it, but indeed, there's this question of authorship and proprietorship, right? Owning the work, right? So yes, that's very interesting. I hadn't thought about it, and there's a whole aspect to it which is very interesting because of part of this, collective sharing and circulation of the work would be the idea of giving up ownership or giving some form of traditional ownership, which authorship is historically. So yeah, thank you very much for that. That's very, very interesting. I will think about that. Thank you.
Could I raise another question?
Of course.
It's the way that time is structured in literature. I suppose Amitav Ghosh is thinking about the contemporary novel.
Yeah.
But we do have more ancient forms of storytelling, like legend, where time is very complex. It's not a linear process. Time and characters are interwoven in very dynamic but not linear ways. I just wondered whether Helen and Newton's work correspond much more closely to forms of storytelling that belong to legend.
Yes, absolutely. Actually, in The Great Derangement, Amitav Ghosh, he talks mostly about the novel, but he does talk a lot about epics and the fact that epics, at the beginning of his book, he talks about the fact that epics do have this larger temporal scale, and the novel as a genre loses that through the focus on individual lifespans or, generations, but still generations. The temporality of generations is nothing compared to the temporality of ecosystems, indeed. And there's a whole critique of the novel as a genre, but he does posit the epic, as an alternative to that. And indeed, I think that in the case of Helen and Newton, we do have this kind of epic temporality that is revisited, and it's very interesting also in Powers, because Powers is his work on the surface is this novel is a realist novel, but actually he's very much into ancient wisdom, animism, legends, myths, ancient storytelling. And so I think his revisiting very similar kinds of temporality through storytelling, these larger sort of mythical categories of time that we have in older narrative forms. So yes, absolutely, yes. Thank you very much for that remark. Yeah.
I have to say here that you're right. We were influenced, I don't say influenced, but touched by the novel form. I really, like when I was reading Tolstoy, I found it so interesting that he was so complex. By the time you were in chapter 10, he was referring to something in chapter 1. You had a clue what he was talking about. So you had to head all the way back to chapter 1 to find out. And that influenced the lagoon cycle. When you put it all up, when you read the first lagoon, by the time you got to the fifth lagoon, you realized you misunderstood the first lagoon, and so on. And so we took I don't say influence. I don't think I am influence. We just took permission. And that's what our work is about, is to give permission as best we can. And when you talk about generosity, we didn't think generosity. We just thought that every single project was such a boon to us, was such a fine thing to happen, like to land in the city of Atlanta and suddenly realize they were in violation of the Second Amendment of the Constitution of the country in their design. So we always set out to give much more than we took. And if we didn't see it as generosity, we saw it as a moral obligation. And if we couldn't see our way to that, we didn't take the work.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that for Camus, from where I started, indeed, generosity is a form of moral obligation.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So,
Thank you
also,
so
one
much.
last thing about
Yes.
this wall, and that is, remember, we did this in 1975.
Yes.
We started it in 76, I think,
Yes.
and finished it 77. Well, all that time, the discourse in the arts were simple.
Yes.
That a work of art had to give up its identity immediately.
Yes. Yeah.
You had to have instant knowing and stuff like that. Or as everybody, so every work had to do this and be self-explaining. And Helen and I said, not us. We're going to be as complex as the situation demands. Thank goodness for simple situations, made it easier. But you had to obey the situation. You didn't come to it with anything but a pre-existing notion that you could probably use maps and drawings and storytelling, but that's all you knew until finally we got to love where we were, felt indebted for the pleasure of doing it, and therefore gave as good as we could.
Absolutely. There's a wonderful, wonderful complexity at work here. And what you're saying about the simplicity, or not the simplicity, but the kind of bareness that was expected of certain art forms back then, I think it's still true today. That there's a certain expectation. Yes. So that's why I wanted to, to foreground, to highlight this wonderful complexity, which is, well, poetic, artistic. And I think that close reading is very important to reveal that.
So do I.
And close listening to.
But our work is very difficult to do that with the present set of prejudices that run through the art world. And that is, it's got to be on the wall, you got to understand it immediately, then presumably it'll be sellable, and then auctionable, and then you'll go up the thing, and pretty soon your riches creases, and your work looks stupider and stupider, if you don't mind being blunt.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Tim Collins. Tim is an artist, author, and planner in the Collins and Gatto studio. He works across disciplines to develop creative projects related to landscape, science, culture, and public space. He describes his work as socially and environmentally engaged research, incorporating collaboratives, critical analysis, and deliberate future imaginaries in the final form of his work. He collaborates with an anthropologist and a social scientist on rural landscapes and forestry issues. Tim is on the board of the Landscape Research Group and the Glasgow Sculpture Studies. He sits on a local Nature Reserve Committee and the Native Woodland Discussion Group Committee. Tim.
Thank you, Heath. Thank you, Tatiana, and thank you, Sasha, for organizing all of this. This is it's a pretty amazing day. It's inspiring after 2.5 years of hiding out at home. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to do this. So I just push that? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to talk about ideas and provocations in environmental arts working. I'm going to start with a section on experience, perception, and value, basically talking about my own subjective evolution as an artist in relationship to the work of my friends Helen and Newton. I'll also provide a propositional framework of what I think environmental arts working could mean. And then I'll close with a short piece about theorizing a relational response to the climatic and environmental condition that we find ourselves in today. So to get at the environmental arts working, I realized I needed to consider what it means to be an arts worker over 50 years ago. As an undergraduate, I learned about the compost maker and the fish farmer. By the time I was immersed in graduate school, I was in the water library at UC Berkeley, reading about meditations on the Sacramento River. I would then fall into the epic narrative of the lagoon maker and his witness. This is the formative background to my current interest in environmental artworking. I will begin with a review that tracks my own experiences in changing perceptions and values. Then I will present a propositional framework followed by some thoughts about theorizing the relational response. So let's see if this works the way I think it's going to. So I don't think you can quite appreciate what it was like to be 20 years old in art school at the University of Rhode Island with a man called Richard Calabro, who had studied at UC San Diego. And he would every once in a while bring in slideshows of people that were doing work that was materials-based, that was process-based. And I remember the day he showed this to us. This is Newton making dirt. He's still got this, eating dirt as the culmination, the aesthetic proof of the work, so to speak. I notice you still got the same hairstyle, Newt. But you know, as a young working class kid from Rhode Island, when they put this up when he put this up on the slide screen, we all started laughing. We said, "This is crazy. What's he doing?" And it got more interesting from there. So we learned about making earth, working with Richard Ronald Honorato, who was the art historian at the University of Rhode Island. He would talk to us about the survival pieces. Again, radically challenging what I thought I was in school for. So this constant sense of being pushed off balance was the thing that stayed with me, you know, to this day. So I went on to learn about the lagoon cycle while I was still at the University of Rhode Island. I would then go on to the San Francisco Art Institute, where I would learn about the Sacramento meditations. I would spend time at the Berkeley Water Library, working my way through some of the research that you've done, learning as much as I could about this. Again, fundamentally challenging what I understood about art practice. I also learned about the Art Park Spoils Pile effort, which is a spectacular bit of work. Public art was very much part and parcel of the cultural adventure of being in San Francisco at that time. We also learned about the Baltimore Promenade. I was lucky enough to attend various talks. I actually heard a talk about the Sava River and the scope and scale of that national restoration effort. It just incited my mind. But it was the serpentine lattice that did me in, did both Reiko and I in. We were up at the College Art Association in Seattle, and Newton and Helen were talking, and Reiko and I were just incredibly inspired. They were talking about that work. They were talking about the differences in how they work. Helen was describing herself as a researcher. Newton, I remember, was teasing her that she had antennae that came out of the back of her head that identified the most important issues in anything they were even beginning to think about. It was a powerful talk. We went up and introduced ourselves afterwards, and they said, "Oh, by the way, the work is at Reed College." And we had driven up, so we drove down to Reed College to see that work. As we settled into the gallery to watch the slideshow and listen to the language, first, just the social economic analysis, the international policy positions that they were taking in this work were again a whole new stretch. It was going in places that nobody else was going. And then all of a sudden we realized there's people crying in the room. You know, the bottom line is this work was created, 3 years after the Redwood protests. Huge protests that were occurring in Northern California, all kinds of complications going on. And here was an integrative, restorative, radically different approach to what the last rainforest in North America means. We learned about the green heart of I was going to say London. That's not right. Of Holland, through lectures and talks. Again, another important work, a work that shifts the scale yet again. Oops, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. The endangered meadows of Europe. We were lucky enough to actually go to the museum and take a look at that work, and we heard Helena Newton talk about it extensively. A radical vision, you know, to actually assemble meadows that were being destroyed across Europe on the roof of a museum, to bring their import back into the public discourse. We also learned about casting a green net through artist talks and exhibitions. We had gotten to know Helena Newton Harrison pretty well by that time, and they invited us quite a few times to their home to talk us through and engage us in a conversation about what this work means and how it functions in the world. Peninsula Europe in 2001 and 2003 was a really important planning work, a massive scale, thinking about the highlands, the highland areas and the watersheds and the actual fundamental import of international systems of preservation, restoration, and value over time. The proposal for new research on Peninsula Europe, again, was another shift, another push into a different way of making, not a way of making that's about doing something specific, but a way of thinking about it as an ongoing research initiative that gets to the point through an iterative process over time. Greenhouse Britain, we were involved in various discussions and presentations about that, the exhibition. And of course, the culminating work is the Force Majeure, a university-based research center. A university-based research center in arts and environment. In a time where arts and environment research in universities around the world is falling apart. It's falling apart at the same time that the environmental humanities are exploding. Environmental humanities are adding research centers, they're hiring staff 6 ways from Tuesday. But within the environmental arts, we still can't seem to see our way clear to a topical inquiry, to a research inquiry that's essential to our future. So I think I'm doing okay. So I want to talk a little bit about environmental artworking. This piece has been written a number of times. Most recently, I had some critical input from Dave Pritchard and Jan van Beckel, which was very helpful. So art can be determined by its cognate relations, its resemblance or similarity to work that is recognized as art in either form, content, or concept. It can also be recognized by its significant otherness, the way it engages meaning and value beyond the practical. It cannot be defined in such a way that any one term holds true for all work produced by artists. Art is a generative area of human inquiry that constantly challenges its own boundaries, and as a result is resistant to any attempt at finite analytical definition. We offer the following ideas as a means of grappling with the approaches, methods, and ideals that art are found amongst artists with an interest in art, ecology, and the human dimensions of environmental change. Discussions of interdisciplinarity lead to questions about the relationship between knowledge and creativity. What does it mean to be intellectually and creatively prepared to work across art and natural science, social science, or philosophy and ethics? What follows are some general thoughts about the different way artists come to questions of the environment. What we describe are not silos, but rather overlapping or relational ideas, an evolving framework that could be used to think about what artists do and how they go about environmental artworking in the 21st century, as we come to grip with environmental conditions that upend the imaginary of future selves, society, and cultures. Environmental arts practice is the general term for the work of many artists. Contemporary practice is an evolving process of creative inquiry with specific ideas and materials. The outcome, more often than not, is a material object or an experience of materiality. The artist practitioner trusts that the work speaks for itself and that once complete, it leaves the studio. And at that point, the artist's intentions and ideas about meaning are really not relevant to the experience of the work by others. A professional artist is aware of discipline-specific context. A singular work or a body of work can be a strategic response to the past or an evolving practice in the present. The artwork can also be experienced as a lyrical, expressive, or metaphorical exposition of the artist's subjective experience of the world, processed and considered internally before being explored and ultimately manifest through creative engagement with ideas and materials. Those that experience and engage that work complete the work through aesthetic perception, ascribing our own meaning and/or value to the artwork. The artwork can also be informed by experience, response scenarios, which shift the artist's central inquiry. A simple concept map would include the artist, the artwork, and the audience. Critical arts practices involve philosophy, ideas, belief, and meanings, or critical theory, ideas about social change, embedded in, or perhaps tested in practice. The outcome of the actual artwork has a conceptual clarity that can either be embedded in materiality or performativity, or it can forego the physical experience altogether and rely on text or language-based forms of communication. In this kind of artwork, an idea, a statement, or an allegory is the essential aesthetic element perceived by the audience as they consider the work. Philosophies relevant to arts and ecology would include aesthetics and ethics, but also environmental aesthetics, deep ecology, social ecology, feminist ecology are all relevant to the development of practice in art and ecology. Post-colonial theory and ideas about the indigeneity of people, living things, and practices are also relevant to this topic. Critical theory is focused on liberating people, places, and things from the circumstances that constrain them. Given that nature is primarily nonverbal, there is also a discourse theory that informs ethical standards and constraints on how artists might represent the interests of more than human others. Ideas can be integrated with informing practice or tested through practice in a range of ways. The work is ideally received and engaged with attention to shifts in meaning, perception, and value. The concept map here includes the artist, the topical inquiry, theory, artwork, and audience. Art-based research is fundamentally differentiated by attention to the social discourse, the reflective consideration of the development, process, and outcome of the research amongst peers and interested parties. Responsibility for how one's work contributes, extends, or critiques current ideas or practices. Arts-based research, or practice-based research, is informed by history and theory. It requires an understanding of current work in the field and can address a topic within the field of art itself, or like other disciplines, a topic out with the field. Environmental arts research can be understood as a process of investigation leading to new insights, new outcomes, and an evolution of values that are effectively shared. The focus is the same as the previous definition. It is an ecological and environmental change, or the social and political conditions, the human experience of said change. Arts-based research is about the intervention and generation of ideas, images, performances, and artifacts, where these lead to new or substantially improved insights about material and methods, the application of new technologies, or ideas that can be tested in practice. As impact is often a consideration for research, we're talking about artwork with potential benefit to other artists, to a specific segment of society, and/or an eco-cultural body. Artworking that reveals new critical awareness of aesthetics, behavior, ethics, performance, practice, extant values, or understanding. The concept map is the artist, topical inquiry, theory, artwork, discursive audience. Making art with a topical focus is alternately a usual and unusual endeavor in our field. In one way, artists have always responded to and reflected the world around them. In another way, artists have long pursued other disciplines for ideas rather than practical application, and sought socio-ecological and political entanglements that are essential to its evolving value. Most of us that have lived for 3 or 4 decades understand the depth and scope of human-initiated changes in the environment and the challenges of climate change. We assume that art cannot be defined, nor is it easily confined to one material, method, or theory. The arts work from the historical center outwards in search of boundaries to cross where new experience, perception, or meaning is possible. This is a significant factor in why artists working on environmental conditions see the world differently, tend to reinterpret history, and imagine unexpected futures. The preceding ideas about environmental artworking are intended as a contribution to the discourse, how we talk about artworking in relation to the world of ideas and materials we are immersed in. Everything described here is art. Environmental practice, critical practice, and research-based practice. Any artist practice might embrace one or more, or all of these ways of environmental artworking. One way is no more valid or important than the other, although methods and outcomes differ in the ways we engage the world and what it means. That cultural diversity and how it contributes to experience, perception, and the meaning of our changing world is worth talking about. So the last section here is about theorizing relational response. The 20th century can be broadly characterized by 2 world wars and changing ideas about democracy, capitalism, socialism, communism, nationalism, and globalism. Tensions and strains would often emerge where nature and culture came into contact. Scientific and technical knowledge flourished, and exploration and transport shifted from feet and horses to motor cars, trains, ships, planes, and eventually spacecraft. Fossil fuels were the plentiful resource that enabled these changes. Combustion of fossil fuels have rapidly loaded the atmosphere with the greenhouse gases that have driven global culture to the edge of what I call the precipice. This precipice is the condition where the mounting global climate deficit shakes the foundations of industrial economies and capitalist democracies. It is a time when the environmental conditions upend the imaginary of future selves, societies, and cultures. The world in all its material vitality and more than human agency is flooding back into our day-to-day lives with unexpected consequences. A powerful challenge to seeing ourselves as being in control of the future, or perhaps even having a future. The last great change in global society was ushered in the shadow of the Cold War and the threat of nuclear annihilation in the 1960s. Social and environmental inequities came into focus. Arts and culture found new purpose, and everything seemed to be up for question, or at least discussion. The meaning, form, and function of artworking was changing, with radical experiments in the relationship between artists, places, tools, materials, and ultimately ideas and meanings. Lucy Lepard, writing about the dematerialization of the art object in 1973, would document much of it, but in terms that were often considered controversial. In 1979, Rosalind Krauss would focus on the relationship between sculpture, architecture, and landscape, describing an expanded field of inquiry. Reflecting on this time, Mi-Wan Kwan and others would recognize that the physical evolution of the art object was being replaced by the studio as a place to study, to plan, to consider the evolution of one's ideas. Helen Molesworth, the editor and curator of Work Ethic, reflecting on Hart and Negri's Empire, offers an account of art labor, domestic labor, and the creative industries, describing a shift from productive labor, the production of artifacts, material goods, and specific services, to immaterial labor, the work of creating cultural products, the production and commodification of knowledge and information services, to the performance of gender and domestic roles, characterized and effective, caring and attention to social well-being. Following a similar line of inquiry, John Roberts, writing about the evolution of the avant-garde in 2015, offers important insight into art, labor, and its relationship to freedom and autonomy. Or perhaps more importantly, why it still matters in the present and the future. He argues that one of the critical functions still left to the artist on this score is their ability to borrow from and invest in various knowledge bases without placing themselves at the instrumental services of such disciplines and practices. And this, as a matter of art self-definition, is something that should not be underestimated or undervalued. John goes on to argue that adisciplinarity tests the boundaries of knowledge in art, and at the same time, the limits and validity of ideas expressed in the biological, physical, and social sciences. He cautions that adisciplinary research is not meant to privilege artists' work, but to challenge extant perceptions and values, to contribute and enable experiential, cognitive, and intellectual inquiry that is autonomous by intent, with moral attentions to ethics and freedom, enabling, or perhaps simply contributing, to a space where instrumental and commodifying forces of capital are not the dominant priority. It would seem that the plateau that we can variously understand as the Enlightenment, enabling the freedom of men, by marshaling the material resources and labor in the world as economic goods. Or perhaps modernism is a better idea to grapple with, the ideal that science and technology would result in an ever better quality of life. It would alleviate all need and protect us from the ravages of nature. Yet we find ourselves immersed in a time of global impacts that have accrued by ignoring the byproducts or the hybrids. This is all after Latour, of course. Industrial culture and its scientific and engineering advances have evolved with significant byproducts, things that bring us to the precipice at the edge of the plateau. It is either a nightmare or the beginning of a new renaissance in a more than human relationship to the world. We have begun to embrace a more than human idea of consciousness, an appreciation of a vast realm of identities, and an understanding of diverse networks and agencies. In essence, with the precipice before us, we are starting to see beyond the limitations of self-imposed isolation, the old conditions of being human. We live in a time where global experience reinforces a transformative quickening of ideas and practices. We are learning to, or maybe being forced, to see the world with fresh eyes, learning to embody otherness and empathize in unexpected ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Tim. Really stimulating. I started to wonder whether about the term environmental artists, the way, if you like, separating one kind of artist from another kind of artist. So I was wondering, can you imagine, possibly in the very near future, that term will become redundant and that all artists will be actually addressing in some way the existential crisis that we're in?
Well, I think that's the myth that operates today, and to be honest, topical inquiry in the art schools around the world is at best a secondary concern. So, you know, honestly, given the conditions that we're in today, I think we have to evolve a new culture with that environmental focus if we're going to, if the arts are going to stay part and parcel of this discussion. Training ourselves to think beyond our own discipline, training ourselves with philosophy, politics, ecological science, neuroscience, you know, all of these things are essential to the evolution of creative practice. And all of these things are hugely resisted in the art world. I've had a number of conversations with curators in Scotland recently, and they're all pretty clear that, yeah, the environment's important. Artists are engaged in the emotional response to the losses we face. But we don't really have much grasp in other areas. So I think the art world has to change. I think the fact that, you know, when I first came to the UK, there was 6 or 7 different environmental arts research centers. We're down to one or two. At the same time, you know, I can't tell you how pleased I am to say that the environmental humanities have taken off like a hot rocket with research centers, with new faculties. They're thinking so far beyond their discipline. And meanwhile, we're still worrying about material practice and traditional skill makings. And oh, by the way, jobs. Did I say jobs? Jobs. You know, so yeah, I think we need to focus. That's my opinion. I know you may differ. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to jump on Anne's question. I'm going to get a copy of your slides and change the word art to science in every sentence. And I think it makes equal sense. So what, I guess Anne was criticizing dividing the arts into environmental arts and so on. You know, why do we insist on subdividing knowledge into art and science? And what I wrote down was environmental science making, so not environmental art making, and that slight shift in vocabulary. So how does science provoke desirable changes in human behavior rather than resulting in greater knowledge? And that art making sort of shifts the evaluation not onto increasing knowledge, but changing human behavior. And I think that's part of what you're saying about artworks versus art making, artworking, sorry.
As one who was made redundant 7 years ago for practicing art and ecology at Manchester Metropolitan University, when the then Dean of Faculty deleted ecology as a subject of interest and research within the faculty. It's really, really interesting and even more heartening to know that now, despite my departure, most of the students who are studying art and, as Tim says, the social sciences are really concerned, deeply concerned about the crises that we face.
Yes.
As artists, they are trying to engage. As designers, they're trying to engage. As people in literature, history, and so on and so forth, they're trying to engage. Unfortunately, the one faculty that does not wish to engage now is science and engineering. Now, in terms of academic progression or whatever, of course, Tim, you're absolutely right. The arts still don't see any future in something called environmental or ecological arts. But I do see a groundswell of younger people who actually just see it, if you like, as their whole being, as their understanding. I was grounded some years ago when I asked a group of architecture students, who here was born, before 1992? And of course, they were all born after 1992, when we all became aware that there was something called climate change. So these younger people, actually, it's completely within their whole understanding and living and being. So actually, a lot of the strategies, I think, that were employed by people like myself and others are now redundant. Frankly, we don't have to make people aware anymore. We need to actually engage people in how they can mobilize themselves, in my opinion. And that's actually where organizations like Extinction Rebellion, Black Lives Matters, Me Too, and so on and so forth are actually creating new ways of actually actioning things. If you're as old as me, and Newton, I know, will verify this, we went through the 60s and we saw a lot of idealism and utopian ideas brought forward. Well, I think those have been busted. And in fact, the new generation of activists are sober. They don't smoke dope. They don't eat mushrooms, etc., etc. I knew they might be missing out on something. But nevertheless, I see that politics has to now try and wean them off their ideas of reality. So I'll leave it at that. Anyway, I've had my speech.
That's great, David. I think you've come at the issue. Sorry.
Well, just let me add one thing here. Helen and I faced this early on, and we decided to be indifferent to disciplines, whatever they were. Rather, out of every situation, the situation would tell us what we needed to know. And if I had to do the science for something, I can do it, providing I don't have to worry too deeply about Feynman-type math, you know. I mean, like, come on. I don't know if you could do it either.
No, I got it. Not anymore.
Anyway, what I'm getting to is that if you adapt, if you do what every living thing does that's not us, it faces the environment and does what it needs to do to continue. Okay? So when we're making a work of art, we do what we need to continue. And that may be I might have to learn something about plate tectonics, which happened once. Helen had to redefine anthropology to get and actually invent ethnomethodology to do our first lagoon, where we interviewed people all over Sri Lanka and found out they were going to have war soon. And our response was, can we stop it? So we began to make a campaign in Sri Lanka not to build the Mahabali Dam because it was going to flood the Tamil villages and things of that sort. So what we did was, we were political when we had to be political. We were hostile when it seemed to be hostile time. And so it's the freedom that you have to do. You have to be free to do this. If you are stuck in a discipline, your freedom is limited and framed. And that's why I'm totally indifferent to science, art, or any of the rest of that stuff. Like if I'm facing the ocean, if I'm facing the ocean, I'm facing the ocean. I'm taking it on the best I can, and so on. So I think we need a whole new kind of teaching in our schools, and it has to reach way beyond the arts. We have to, in my judgment, we have to shift ourselves out of being specialists, be generalists, and become specialists when needed. I'm a generalist. If I need to become a specialist in something, the situation will tell me. Moreover, the situation will tell me how deep I have to go. So if I have to go into plate tectonics, it's enough for me to understand how the Kuriel Trench, for instance, and the upwelling of the Kuriel Islands happened, and that stands for almost all plate tectonics for me. And so I learned enough from a PhD student who I was on his committee, so he had to teach me and Ellen his discipline in 3 hours or I'd fail him. So he did. In 3 hours, boy, were we knowledgeable. Of course, I wasn't going to fail him. I was just going to not do the PhD. But if you can't teach me what you're doing in 3 hours, then you don't know what you're doing. So that's how I think we have to shift. I think we have to shift back to being the kind of generalist, but not copying them. The kind of generalist that your first peoples were, where they were special, they were generalists. They would be in the forest. They had to know 5,000 species. They had to know all kinds of stuff, including how to make their weapons and how to grow things when they needed and how to fight when they needed, and so on. And so that when somebody had to become very good at something, or they had a special talent, well, then they became an expert at making arrows, fletching or whatnot. So I think we got it just exactly backward for everything. And I don't know how to get that across except to behave how I behave and how Helen behaved. We just have to be models of what we're talking about.
Can I just...
So we have time for 2 more questions, comments.
Can I just say, I think pedagogically, that's loud. What you're saying is we have to teach people in school how to teach themselves. And what you're saying is you constantly taught yourself, and we don't do enough. We don't do enough to allow people to give them the skills to teach themselves. And that's, to me, essential for what Newton's saying about his practice and what we'll have to do in the future if we want to be transdisciplinary. Because you never know, like Newton said, what we're going to have to learn.
Back to Socrates.
Well, I'll just bring this up briefly. What happened to the word creativity? I know it's been co-opted terribly by corporations, but I think we should take it back. And Diane Beresford-Kreuger, who's one of my heroes, I don't know how many of you know her book, The Global Forest, but she actually says artists are, in her mind, top dog, because we can envision outside the boundaries. We don't have to prove what we're going to do. We can go for really operating very flexibly and on a vast knowledge. And that science is her next hero. And all creativity in her comes from nature, and I happen to agree with her. But scientists have to be able to prove what they're going to do. So it limits something. There's a boundary there. And but the two coming together is sort of the essence of how we're going to do this. But I think we really have to reclaim that word in its largest possibility. If you're going to talk about educational programs I took groups of students and I decided that I wasn't going to do anything that wasn't art and activism. I wasn't going to teach it. There are very few places that like that. The students loved it. The professors would never come to my lectures, even if it was 200 or 300 students. So there was always an obstacle, but for exactly the reasons you described and Newton described. But I really think, like Newton, you and Helen were vastly creative people, flexibly creative, and forging a whole new pathways. And that can be done now in and as many people who are doing it will do it and do it differently, and we will have different pathways. And let's face it, describing education in old terms doesn't work. You know, I started a feminist art studio at Cornell, the first one in a university. The PhD in education wouldn't give me the money because I didn't have the right vocabulary from his point of view. I said, no one has a vocabulary here. How am I going to have a vocabulary that you understand? So then I went to the dean, and they actually gave me the money to do it. 3 years later, that same guy always said, oh, I have a PhD in education of 12 years. I said, well, I guess that's what's wrong with you. I can have a bad mouth. And 3 years later, he asked me if I had another good idea. I said, I guess you don't get a lot of them, do you? So, I mean, there's huge rigidities that we function and are unaware of. But as artists, that you can break out of them, teach students to break out of them, all kinds of ways. That's enough, sorry.
So we should be wrapping up our discussion to have a break and lunch.
One last thing to say, the Bauhaus teachers in the 30s made great efforts to break disciplinarity, and they did so with their problems. I talked to Roger about it a bit, like they would give students a problem, make a light thing look heavy. You do? What's that really saying is surprise the hell out of somebody and break their expectations. Or they give a problem like, take a 2-pound brick and with a ball of spring and 5 Q-tips, make a structure that will hold the 2-pound brick up in the air. And so all of a sudden, they're intuitive engineers. Nobody told them they couldn't do it. You see, the Bauhaus was based on these problems. Nobody would tell these kids that come in, who said you can't make this? Or as Albers started out with, make one color look like 2, then 2 colors look like 4. Then he would do grouping and clustering. By the time it was finished, you could compose differently. Your eyes changed, and things of that sort. We need much more intimate kinds of teaching, and we need to become the generalists we are, genetically speaking. We're set up to do this, and we're running against our own biology to become specialists like this. Other than that, like I said before, we're screwed. But the point is that I actually personally believe that the shock that's going to happen with global warming and other things will be our teachers.
I was actually involved in a lot of different multidisciplinary things. The dramatic arts, the visual arts, the literary arts, the musical arts, and of course science as well. I was middling in all of them, of course, but when it came down to thinking about the future and coming from a working class background, I figured that I would study in college something that was more technical, like science, and, because I might be able to get a job actually. But I did love being involved with drama. I was a high school thespian. I was in the College Players when I was at university. If I remember correctly, I played Winston Smith in 1984 with over 300 lines to be memorized, including a 5-minute soliloquy. And I just did that for fun, From the visual arts side, I've been a photographer since I first got a nice camera when I was a teenager. So I took a lot of pictures for the college yearbook and newspaper. I ended up advancing through that system, again, totally for fun, and became the editor of my my college yearbook my senior year, which gave me full tuition remission as a side product. On the literary side of things, I wrote reviews of rock and roll records and concerts for my college newspaper. I wrote a lot of other stories for the yearbook as well. I was very much into Dungeons and Dragons back in the mid-'70s when it was just starting to become very popular. And the whole creativity involved in being a dungeon master and creating your own worlds is something that I was able to actually share with some of my PhD students about a year ago, to show them what it's really like to play D&D with dice and one person explaining everything and everyone else just having to react and interact among themselves to try to solve problems. On the musical side of things, ever since I think I was about 5, I learned like piano lessons. I switched to rock and roll guitar when I was a teenager. Singing I was at a Lutheran school for both elementary school and high school, and so there was constant singing as well. So I at least could carry a tune. So how does that affect I eventually got a PhD and focused completely on being a scientist starting around 1980. And how did the arts of the past affect my science? Pause. I think the dramatic arts were really important, and I learned that it took a long time before I became really comfortable on a stage, right, giving a scientific talk. It's really important to do something different, to speak in a different way and wake people up in the audience, to tell a joke, something to make people remember your talk, as well as, of course, the message of the talk, which is the whole point of the talk. But the dull, long day of listening to talks at a scientific meeting can be so much more energized by having someone get really excited about the stuff and maybe stumble and fall on the stage just as a joke. Those are the talks people remember. Next slide, please. It's not clicking. If you can figure out how it works, but there we go. Okay, next thing. I think you skipped over one back. The second one, the visual. So when you are a scientist, you have to create figures and eventually slides to show to people, to convince people that the data that you've analyzed are believable. Doing that can be simply plotting things and making X's and O's, and it looks really boring. If you can actually juice up a figure to make it much more appealing, people will remember it much better. So what makes a highly cited figure? Next, there we go. So doesn't really matter what this is. This is actually sea surface temperature of the North Pacific, shown here, 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 and here. Back in 1976, this pattern of cooling in one area and warming in another was sort of discovered as an important large-scale pattern of sea surface temperature. It was also published by Brian Weir over here in 1976. It was also discussed by Zhang et al. In 1977, and many others have studied that singular pattern. All of a sudden, in 1997, Nate Mantua publishes this figure, which shows exactly the same pattern in the North Pacific, and it becomes essentially one of the most cited papers in climate sciences since, so in the last 25 years. Because, first of all, I think it has visual appeal, and second of all, he linked it to two different things. He linked it to fisheries, namely salmon, which becomes multidisciplinary, and also he linked it through that connection to fisheries to humans, because humans harvest salmon. So taking a dry study of the North Pacific and turning it into something that connects it to other people in this visually appealing way, I think is one of the key things for getting your figure cited a lot and your paper published. Next slide, please. The literary. So I would say that, again, when you write publications, when you write proposals, using more flowery and fun language makes people want to read it and pass it on to the next person. In particular, if you write a proposal, you write it like a detective novel. That first paragraph is the hook. You got to tell them what people think they know, what actually is out there, and say, how can this be that we don't understand how these two things conflict with each other? So telling a story in a proposal gives it a much better chance of making it get funded, and also to help your paper be passed on to others as well. The next slide, please. Oh, actually, I want to say one more thing about that writing in a flowery way. Walter Monk, who is sort of the most distinguished oceanographer at Scripps, he just died a few years ago at age 101, and some people call him the Einstein of the ocean. He was a very mischievous fellow throughout his years, and he told a story where he was studying theoretically the ocean, and in the atmosphere, he explained that typically you take an atmospheric system and you just pretend that it has no top, basically, and he called that the topless atmosphere. In his ocean model, he actually said it could go down to infinity this way. So he wanted to write in the paper, well, it's traditionally done that people study topless atmospheres. Here, we're going to study a bottomless ocean. He actually got cold feet and he didn't publish it that way, but he likes to tell the story. So the musical arts, that's one thing that never really got sort of, I think used in science presentations or anything like that until recently. Go ahead and next slide, please. So I never really realized it, but over the decades that I've been in science, I've had guitars and called people over to my house. We've met at various meetings and had just numerous jam sessions and karaoke nights at our place and around the world. So people, I think, open up to you as colleagues and share things with you when you connect through that universal energy of shared music. So I think it actually is important in sort of at least a peripheral way. Next slide, please. That came to even more fruition when, or greater fruition, I should say, when Rob Esler, who was a PhD student at UCSD in the music department, he was a percussionist. He's there with the red shirt on the right side. Back in 2005, and he wanted to have a workshop where you try to connect music and the environment, or more broadly, art and science. So we together put together a workshop called The Confluence of Art, Music, Science, and the Environment, starting off with a performance in Anza Borrego Desert, where he set up his drums and other two different bands played as well with percussion instruments. This is the Canyon Overlook. If you go to the next slide, can you hit the next slide, please? You'll see some other shots of him setting his drums up in the canyons there, where he lets the environment affect the delivery of the music. We also invited several people to come, including Ruth over here was involved with her friend Joyce, if I remember right. Yeah. And Lillian and Christopher Peebles are also pictured there because they came to the workshop back in 2006. And we had just a really lively time, explaining how each of our fields are affected by each other. Later on, circa 2009, I had a PhD student who got involved with these interdisciplinary programs called the IGERT. I'm not going to tell you exactly what it is. One of the things they had to do is, during their kind of summer boot camp, the communications week, you had to concoct a 1-minute story that you can put on a YouTube video that you could then convey some information about what it is that you want to convey. So I had to learn how to do communications. So my student, Lauren, asked me to be the climate rock star. Lauren's there on the upper left, and these two are the climate change models, right? Get it? And then we recorded it, and you could see Matthew down there at the lower right with the fan blowing the hair back, and I pull out my guitar and found some funny clothes in my closet that I never wear normally. And if we break now to the YouTube video, I think Tatiana is going to play it. Normally I would just go to the next slide and it would play automatically, but it doesn't work in her system.
Dr. Art Miller is a scientist who works with climate models to show the world the effects of climate change. His models work well for the scientific community, and now he's developed 2 new models that everyone will pay attention to.
Climate change is real, it's a pretty big deal, so listen what I'm gonna say. Greenhouse gases and temperature rise can affect us in a pretty big way. Now sea level rise will bring tears to our eyes when the polar bears got no snow. But there are things we can do so it won't come true. There's no excuses, now you know. Climate change, change our ways. 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 Just give it a chance. Be a rock star. Do something about climate change. There we go. Okay, so that was in 2009. Please move the window away from the shared application. So that's when now fast forward to 2017, when actually it was probably more like 2015 when the whole thing started, when Tatiana and Sasha set up this thing called Weather on Steroids, the Art of Climate Change. So they were able to entice some artists to write proposals to convey the message of climate change through their art. And as part of that, Scripps scientists interacted with them before they wrote their proposals to help them coordinate the way they wanted, the information that they wanted to convey to make sure it was correct and that it actually made some sense. So I actually worked with, I think, at least 6 people that I could find from past emails. Lillian Peebles, who is here right now, who ended up producing The Tipping Point, which is shown right here with the globe made of marble on the edge of a cliff being knocked off by a pudgy, sort of yellow-haired man. And I also talked with Cheryl Leonard, who did using natural objects and then recording the sounds that come out of them. So here we're blowing on these flutes made of kelp seaweed. And this is the project that she did, which involved sand hitting these glass plates that then resonates and makes sound that she turns into the sounds of sort of like rain or waves breaking on a beach, and long-term effects on how sea level erodes cliffs and things like that. Judith Hersko did a 400 parts per million thing related to impacts of global warming on humans, and then there was also Dana Matlock and Paul Turonet and Margarita Leon, and I think the top 4 actually were included in the project, and the other 2 didn't quite make it. Later on, next slide, please. Later on, since at that time I was actually the chair of what's called the Heritage Committee here at Scripps, which tries to preserve the history of the institution. And at that time, there was no way for instance, Sasha had proposed that some of those same art installations from the Weather on Steroids should be brought and installed here at Scripps. And as chair of the Heritage Committee, we decided to be the ones who vet that type of concept, art being installed at Scripps. And so we formed a subcommittee on art to evaluate the projects. And in fact, next slide, please. And in fact, we were able to get several of them installed at Scripps. Here's the Tipping Point, which is now in Nuremberg Hall. There's Lillian and Christopher, and then there's Luna's work that I think Sasha's probably going to talk about this later. It's actually installed in my building over here right now. And and through this process, I got to meet lots of artists too. There were other proposals where we got to meet different people. Like my old pal, Tim Luker, we actually went to the same college together, but we never really did much because he did geochemistry and I did the physics of the ocean atmosphere system. It turns out that he had a sort of a mental change where he created a whole new life as Dr. Tim, the artist. And he does these murals, and they reflect interesting concepts in ecology, conservation, and global warming. And we're working to have these installed as well on the walls of the building that actually he works in as a scientist. Next slide, please. And finally, just in closing, back in that 2006 workshop, I had talked with a friend of mine named Dr. Beth Wingate. She is an applied mathematician that studies climate variability. At the time, she was working at Los Alamos, and now she's a professor at Exeter in the UK. And she said, what a great idea to try to connect science with art and art with science. And she said, I actually write poetry. And she contributed this beautiful poem about when she was at sea that involves looking at a whale and how the whale interacted with her while she was there and how the physical aspects of the ocean connect with the biological aspects of the whale. I'm not going to read it, but if you guys want to look at it, I can send it to you. And I will end with that. Thanks.
So we have a possibility of 2 questions to ask or comments to make.
Thank you very much. I was very much interested in what you said about... Yeah, sure. And it's based on Queneau, the exercises in style, the idea of saying the same story in various ways. But my question would be, how does this work, the style of a proposal? Does your style vary from proposal to proposal? Do you adapt it? And I was interested in the flowery part. Does it have to be flowery, or what other style?
I think, science is a detective story. So tell it like that at the beginning, but when you're doing the hardcore science part, then it becomes more standard, So I think it's the catch, it's the hook at the beginning that I think is really important. And I really learned that by serving on proposal review panels in Washington, D.C. for the National Science Foundation, NASA, NOAA, DOE, all the agencies, and you look through stacks and stacks of proposals, and the ones that people like are the ones that are, energized with powerful words, I think. Now, that doesn't mean that if you're just a famous person, you can just write the same old stuff over and over and get funded. Sometimes that happens too, and sometimes people like me will criticize them for not being creative enough in, coming up with something better and more catchy.
I'm wondering if you could give an example, either from your experience or any other scientist's experience that you know of, where their science was actually inspired by art.
I'm going to jump in here on you. Oh, sorry. No. So the question is fundamental. But it gets into this whole fuzzy area of what is the benefit of disciplines and bringing them together. When I was working in Marseille, we had a young Chilean artist who worked with a scientist who was an expert in hydraulics and water waves. And so they had a big tank where they created artificial waves, tried to model them mathematically, and so on. And then she and he worked on an art exhibit, which they showed in the city of Marseille. And during that project, she noticed some wave phenomena that no scientist had ever noticed before. And they wrote up a scientific paper together describing these novel kinds of waves, and she is co-credited with that scientific discovery. So that's a micro example. But the scientist suddenly said, holy shit, she noticed things that I never noticed in 20 years of looking at these waves. And then they put on an art exhibit. So, but I think it's also, it instrumentalizes, I forget what Newton's, that, is art helped supposed to make science better. It instrumentalizes the whole idea. And so I'm a little bit resistant to, I can probably give you 30 examples of how the collaboration of artists and scientists resulted in new scientific discoveries. But it goes both ways, right? and in between, right? So what is our desirable outcome, success criteria of combining art and science? I think, Newton, why do we encourage artists and scientists to collaborate? I think he's taking a nap. Okay, very good.
I can say that we have in history multiple examples of art that led to science, beginning from Leonardo da Vinci, like Anne Douglas pointed out, to recent artists like Mel Ching. But even at the 19th century, we have artists, scientist artists like Ernst Haeckel, who changed the evolutionary view of biology with his absolutely astounding anemones and other plates that became like a piece of that everybody, educated person, had in their house.
Or the painter Samuel Morse, who invented the Morse code.
Yeah.
He never made money as an engineer, he made money as an artist.
Yeah. So our next speaker is Brendan Ballengée. Brendan is a visual artist, biologist, and environmental educator based in Amandeville in Louisiana. Ballengée creates multimedia artworks inspired from his ecological field and laboratory research. In 2013, the first career survey of his work debuted at the Château de Chamamande in France, which traveled to the museum in Netherlands in 2014. In 2016, a mid-career retrospective of his work opened at the University of Wyoming Art Museum in Laramie, Wyoming. He has received numerous awards and fellowships, including a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship, 2017 awards from the National Academics, including Kirk Futures Institutes, Creative Capital Award, a Guggenheim Fellowship Award 2021, and he was included in the 2020 GREAST 50 Emerging Environmental Leaders. He holds a PhD in Transdisciplinary Art and Biology from the University of Plymouth in England. Currently, he is an adjunct faculty at Ecology and Evolutionary Biology in Tulane University, studying the impact of the 2010 oil spill on Gulf of Mexico fish species. In 2016, Ballengée, in partnership with his wife, sustainable food educator Aurore Ballengée, began the Atelier de la Nature, an eco-educational campus and nature reserve in Armandville, Louisiana.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here. I love being part of this group, and I wish I could see you all in person. It's so nice to see so many faces for friends from so many years. And just to start with, I just want to start by talking about this idea of place. As you might have gathered, I'm in Louisiana right now. I'm in an area of Louisiana which is about 40 miles from the coast in what is Chitimacha land, native Chitimacha land. We are about right on the edge of the Atchafalaya Basin, which is the largest swamp and wetland in North America. So it's a really wonderful part of the universe with a lot of biodiversity. And Louisiana is a very special place and drew me here several years ago to reestablish my studio and home, and my family moved. And I'll talk a little bit about that and talk about some of the projects down here. So as I said, Louisiana is really a special part of the universe. in that we have a lot of terrestrial biodiversity, a lot of freshwater and brackish biodiversity, and we're surrounded, a lot of our coast by the Gulf of Mexico, which in many, many ways is our Amazon rainforest for North America and especially the United States. But as you all know, Louisiana, we have a history of some environmental challenges. I guess most of you all have heard of the 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill. This is a picture from Barataria Bay, which is a highly, highly productive wetland for shrimping, fishing, and it's basically a giant nursery for salt and freshwater species. It's also the home to thousands of shrimpers, oyster folks, fisher folk that rely on this not only as a source of income for commercial fishing, but as a source of food, including like indigenous populations that still live in these wetlands in villages that you can only get to by boat. So yes, the 2010 spill, Deepwater Horizon, it's the largest oil spill in history, as far as we can tell, outside of war times and probably in human histories from what we can tell. It lasted for a little over 4 months as far as just the oil directly pouring into the Gulf. So you can see the scale there, just in a sense. That's from satellite imagery. Now, what happened is, this is the immediate impact. But months after the spill, oil was working its way into protected areas up here, into the Florida Panhandle. It wrapped its way around. It ended up going up through the Gulf Current, and there's some examples that we think it was collected even as far as the Carolinas. And of course, when it went into the food chain, it really spread all over. There's also evidence that some of the oil was found in Mexico. And as I said, this is our Amazon rainforest. I mean, it's a highly productive environment with lots and lots of different ecosystems, lots of different species. And so this was really an unfortunate accident. And the thing is, this is the largest oil spill in history. I'm going to show you right here. This is called Plaquemines Parish. So to give you an idea, New Orleans is up here. This is Plaquemines Parish. And I'll show you the next map. So not only do we have we've had the largest oil spill in history, we've also had the longest running oil spill in history, which started in 2004 and is ongoing currently. So it's also in Plaquemines Parish waters right along this rift. It's called the Taylor Energy Spill. And currently, there's a company that's capping that oil. So there's less release than what happened for more than a decade and a half, but it's ongoing, and there's no effort at all to date to try to stop that. The company that owns this refuses to deal with it. It's the Taylor family, Miss Taylor. She, through a series of litigations, has managed to skirt around trying to fix it. So anyway, just to give you a little background for where we're at. So imagine the Gulf, this is the Mississippi River, which has been moving and migrating for thousands of years. Along the way, before that, this whole area is just home to all this incredible sediment of petrochemicals, natural gas, crude oil. And so the fish and the animals here have really evolved to live with some presence of these chemicals naturally in their environment. There's bacteria and microorganisms that help break them down naturally. But the problem is when you have this volume of oil going into one place for such a long period of time and spreading as it does, it's having environmental impact. So this is a red snapper that was collected a year after the spill had been stopped, the BP spill. The Deepwater Horizon spill. So that really got a lot of us worried about what impact this volume of oil has on the food chain. Such a vital, not just vital in the terms of ecosystems and all the different millions and billions of species that were impacted, but the people, living off of and with these organisms. So it got a group of us to really start to wonder about this. And so, as Tatiana had said, I'm an artist and a biologist. As a biologist, I'm a frog guy. I'm an amphibian guy that's now, since we moved to Louisiana, doing fisheries work. This was an artistic response to the 2010 spill. before we had enough data to publish any of the science, I wanted to kind of work with a team to talk about these fears and these issues and the response that people were seeing, full on even 2 years after the spill. So what happens when all those chemicals, when the oil itself is mixed with chemical dispersants that then make the oil sink, but make it more toxic? How does that impact food webs? And so I would say the artistic response, not scientific, even though it was informed by science, was this installation called Collapse. So this was shown at first in Ronald Feldman Gallery in 2012 in New York City. It's been traveling since then for 10 years to different parts. It finally, after a decade, made its way to Louisiana. So I was really happy about that recently. And what it's literally supposed to be a tiny sketch about the complexity of the Gulf of Mexico foodway. We were talking, so much about the web of life. Just to visualize that, I mean, when we were talking before, I liked how Art was talking about creative strategies. This is a way that myself as a visual artist could team up with some biologists and talk about our concerns, but also think about it from an aesthetic perspective. Like each one of those specimens is curated in the jar. Each specimen, as you can see, probably it's stitched on glass. Each relates on a trophic level to the other to kind of show that web. And then there are empty jars projecting what we thought would be either declining species as a result of the spill or missing species. And so it's about 26,000 preserved specimens. Just to give you an idea about the way the Gulf is so diverse, if we had another 97 of these, almost 98 of these in a space, in a museum, that would give us a better idea of what we know lives in the Gulf of Mexico. And this number is very modest. We're finding new species all the time. So this was an artistic response, also meant to be a memorial, not meant to be didactic in the sense that I wanted people to look at it and somehow come away feeling they'd read a thesis. Instead, I wanted them to have an emotional response, a response of curiosity. Roger talked about curiosity, and as did Newton earlier. So some of the fishes, to give you an example, these beautiful butterfly fish, a lot of these specimens were found during the oil spill. I found thousands, unfortunately, of dead organisms during and after the spill on the beaches here in Louisiana. I also teamed up, as I said, with other biologists that were finding things, and then later shrimpers and fisher folk that I had met, and then they would save specimens and send them to New York. So this is great. This is deep sea isopod. So just to kind of show some of that diversity. And then this is an oil-stained shrimp. So that was really the first kind of big project I did related to the environment here in the Gulf of Mexico, with the intention of generating discourse and interest and awareness that this spill had this continued impact. In 2012, I mean, this was during the Obama administration. Obama had come down with his family. They had swam in the Gulf, and everybody thought everything was okay. At least from a PR standpoint. BP spent billions of dollars on public relations. In the beginning, they were spending more on public relations than cleanup. And as far as, the differences, between improvisation and adaptation, the amount of improvisation when it came to the way they were trying to cover their tracks was incredible. And the amount of improvisation when it came to trying to fix this deep water blowout was remarkable. I think it's almost a miracle we ever fixed it. And it's still leaking, actually, but it's better than it was. So almost as a result of this art project, I got more and more compelled to come down and study life in the Gulf of Mexico. I really fell in love with the organisms in the Gulf, the cultures in the Gulf, and I have, potentially some roots here, family-wise, and I'm still learning about that, Creole roots, and just became captivated with this sense of place. Louisiana is a very special part of the world, culturally and otherwise. It's one place on the planet where, in the United States, where French is still a living language. But just from the nature standpoint, the biodiversity standpoint, the Gulf of Mexico has over 13,000 species of fishes. The estimate is it's probably double that. 77, which I'm going to change this number in a new paper, 78 of which are endemic, meaning they're found nowhere else on the planet but in the Gulf of Mexico. We have one of the most intact coral reefs left, like one of the most intact coral reefs on the planet left in the Gulf of Mexico in Louisiana waters. So it's really an incredible place. So the first kind of science that I started working on when we moved here, and I got my postdoc at LSU, was looking at those endemic fishes. Which of those, what could we tell from the recorded record about that impact? And what we found is that 14 of those 77 have been missing since the 2010 spill. So that's significant. So they hadn't been reported in natural history collections. So the question is, are they there now? Where did they go? And what are the limitations of us as researchers looking for them? So a big part started to become like about science, moving on to citizen science and outreach. So one of the first things we did is I made these posters, these wanted posters that went all over the coast to marinas, to schools, out with fishermen. And we'd go out trying to find some of these missing species. And sure enough, I'll talk about it in a second. This has proven a little bit effective. So wanted missing species, there's 14 since the 2010 spill. And it's interesting, they're found, this is one of the ones from the intact coral reef, Flower Garden National Monument. Some are Deepwater, some are right by the shoreline that should be, close by this Keeper Tula. So there's interesting questions still to be asked there. And that's one of the things I'm working on right now. We're updating this paper, and it turns out there's more missing species, which is where we're going now. This project I'm referring to as Searching for Ghosts of the Gulf, with kind of, to simplify, three major components: activating, portraying, and exhibiting. We talked a little bit about the idea of art merging with activism, and I think there's certainly a side to this project, which is what I consider my form of being an activist, which is about activating the community, portraying, and then exhibiting. So activating, a lot of this has been not only doing the field work, but making sure that the field work is accessible to the public, literally going out to places like this was Elmer's Island, which during the oil spill, super impacted. But it's interesting, a lot of the fish have started to come back. A lot of the wildlife have come back. And we identified one of the missing species at one of these field sites. But also then going out and doing outreach in schools and going to coastal communities, bringing specimens in jars, a natural history collection to different schools that don't normally have the opportunity to go to visit natural history museums or art museums for that matter, because they're rural and they're coastal. This is in Phoenix, Louisiana, one of the schools I work with quite a bit. And these are folks that are really at the front line for climate change. We're talking about impacts of climate change. What's happening to us in South Louisiana is, a decade or more ahead of what's happening to most people in coastal areas. This is Phoenix. It's in Plaquemines Parish. It's the part of the world that is losing land at either the most rapid place or one of the most rapid places. It used to be one of the largest parishes. We use parishes in Louisiana, but now it's shrinking down to the point that it's literally becoming like a levied communities. So this is a very isolated. So in addition to bringing and working with the students on learning about the species that they're coexisting with in the Gulf of Mexico, kind of their neighbors, I'm also teaching them to draw, but not with the intention of teaching drawing in the sense that I want them to make a drawing or teaching them aesthetics. I'm asking them to look at the individual species and look at their adaptations. That's why I got a little hung up on the idea of improvisation versus adaptation earlier, because I'm really trying to work with these communities and show them the way that fish are so successful at adapting to constantly changing environments. By far, fishes are doing great in lots and lots of ways. they're adapting to oil spills in some cases, they're adapting to climate change in some cases, they're adapting to the growing dead zone in some cases, and on and on and on. And so I talk about that, and I talk about how good the fish are at adapting, and I try to use that to talk to people that are being forced with either relocating or trying to adapt to increasingly hostile impacts of climate change. So these are the folks that during Ida, instead of doing classes, we were working together on hurricane relief stuff, you know, just trying to fix their homes enough so that they could come back to living. A lot of these folks do not have anywhere else to go. There's no upward mobility, and there's no system in place to help them relocate yet. We do have our first climate refugees in the United States in just the next island over, which is actually connected to this place, Point Auchan. This is also a Native American community. So talking to these folks, how are we going to adapt to these changes that are coming? Not, you know, soon, they're here now. How do we improvise or adapt to face these changes, or what are we able to do? So really, it's part of having that conversation. And then as an adjunct at Tulane, I'm working in the largest preserved fish collection on the planet. It's incredible. There's upwards of 9 million, maybe 10 million specimens. It's larger than the Smithsonian, the American Museum, the New York Museum, Berlin, Paris, London. Millions of dead fish in jars, dating back over 150 years in World War II bunkers in the middle of a marshland in northern Plaquemines Parish in Bellechase, Louisiana, just south of New Orleans. So it's just another Louisiana surreal story. So World War II bunkers, lots of dead fish, and lots of amazing data to be discovered. And I'm using that space as a classroom. So I've carved out about 2,500 square feet to literally use as an active classroom, where I have government folks and community members come in, and we do these fish drawing workshops and talk about adaptation. And then I'm also using this as an opportunity to make my own artwork, which has, these are x-rays of some of the missing fish. I'm having these made into pirate flags. We do a lot of blessing of the fleet and ceremonies where we're celebrating the water. So these are going to be outfitted on some of the boats during the next blessing of the fleet. That's the beginning of shrimp season. These are actual oil paintings. So these are portraits of some of the missing fishes made with oil, literally crude oil from Deepwater Horizon and that Taylor spill I mentioned. So again, these are, as I'm looking for these fishes, I'm doing these oil paintings, and I'm bringing these oil paintings to libraries and schools to talk about it. So kind of using art to teach science, or at least not even teach science, but to get people inspired to even know these species exist. It's not, I don't consider this work didactic. It's much more about hopefully inspiring. So this is another one of the oil paintings. And then I'm working with fisher folk and oyster people making this food chain piece. So it's a portable version of the collapsed installation we saw earlier. And that's going to be driven to community festivals and marinas here in coastal Louisiana. And then also working on bringing some of these drawings to other festivals, with the idea that people then can outside of the community bubbles, try to share stories of how they're trying to adapt. We like to use this term a lot, resilience. These communities are remarkably resilient, but they're tired, and they need, I think, help adapting and telling their story outside of the area. So I hope that I can play a part in that. We're working on getting kids on the water. A lot of the families that live in Plaquemines Parish have lost their boats historically. So they're literally kids that are surrounded by water, but they don't have any access to the water. So working on programs to get the kids out doing citizen science and helping to collect data, but also, just go fishing and look at the marshlands and look at the change. And look at the way that diversions, which is when you let the Mississippi run its natural course again, grows land, which potentially is a way to help save some of our communities. So just want to say thank you to everybody involved with that project. And I'm going to talk, I think I have a few more minutes left. I'm going to talk just for a few more minutes on a project that Newt and I are working on and what my wife and family are working on. So we moved to South Louisiana from New York City 7 years ago. And 6 years ago, we bought some property. And we titled it Atelier de la Nature, which in French means nature's workshop. About half the people in our area are French speaking. So our programs are bilingual and now more trilingual because we have a growing Spanish speaking population in the area. So it's about 25 acres or a little like around 9 hectares. So just to give you an idea, when we got it, these were soybean fields. This is old sugarcane fields, which has kind of renatured itself. So we're kind of working to bring that back and give you a sense of this is New Orleans. This is where we're at. This is the Atchafalaya Basin, Vermilion Bay, and the Gulf of Mexico. So we've been working to plant lots of plants. As our son Victor, a couple of years ago, we planted over 1,300 baby trees to bring back bottomland hardwood forest. We've been planting prairie grasses. And just as a result, over a little over 5 years, we've had a tremendous amount of life come back. It's incredible. It's like if you make habitat, species come back. So another thing I should say is these were fields were on clay. So once the soybeans were gone, we were left with a giant sheet of clay, which kind of looked like the surface of Mars or something. So a big part of it has been trying to regenerate topsoil, not to regenerate the clay, but to actually build topsoil on that. And through using different plants to help them kind of get going again. And it's been remarkable to see the animals that have come back already. And then we also do a lot of community outreach festivals and educational events and trying to get locals, which are, trying to get them interested in the nature in their backyard. We don't use the term environment a lot because that instantly puts up a wall. What we say is nature because most people here can agree that we love nature. So we kind of use art and science and food and music and try to get people inspired and doing activities like, building bat boxes to help local wildlife and learning about different reptiles and snakes instead of just killing them. And a new project that Newton and myself and Anna Balciava, who's a soil scientist at University of Louisiana Lafayette, and some non-human collaborators have started to work on is what we're calling memory of the life of a Cajun Prairie. Sorry, Newton, I botched up your title. And I added Cajun to it. So Cajun Prairie is really interesting. Where we're at is the southeasternmost portion of what would have been a huge amount of, 2.5 million acres of prairie grasses in Louisiana. You don't normally think of prairie in Louisiana, but we had bison and buffalo and red wolves and lots of different species that aren't really here today. So Newton and I started talking about this a while ago, and we've been working on growing prairie. Newton asked me to get him 200 acres. I said, there's no way I can get you 200 acres. Then he asked me for 20 acres. I couldn't get him 20 acres yet either, but we got 2. And so we're slowly working on this idea, even if it's at a small scale, to try to build this project, looking at the way that prairie can do lots of different things. We know that there's several studies that are looking at the way that prairie grasses are effective at sequestering carbon, more so than hardwood trees or wetlands, but that hasn't been studied in Louisiana. So we're kind of looking at, how these plants may suck carbon in eventually. We're also looking at the way that different types of disturbances may influence prairie diversity. So the idea is to use, various mechanical means, including grazing and potentially burning, to see which of these help with biodiversity. And then also to use this as a teaching tool, to use this to get people to inspire to plant prairie in their backyard, to see if, little by little, we might help reestablish some part of that 2.5 million acres that was lost. So literally you can say that Cajun Prairie is an endangered habitat similar to the Endangered Meadows project that Helen and Newton have worked on many years ago. So with that, I'm just going to end. These are some of our very loud collaborators that have recently come to live with us. And so thank you all very much. And I've got to say, I apologize. We're running. I know everybody's running late. I'm actually going to have to sneak out in a little while and go see a guy about plants. I really do have to go see a guy about plants. I'm not making that up. But thank you all.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let's see, we can ask a couple of questions. Yeah, so right now. Yeah, so let's see if anyone has questions for Brendan.
And also, I just want to invite you all, come visit, come do projects. That's what this space is all about. You know, we need your inspiration. We need your ideas. And you would be most welcome here. Folks here are very, very, very open to coming and sharing their cultures and wanting to learn more about where you're from.
I just would like to say, Brendan, that I really enjoy the way how you make nature very intimate. And in that sense, you overlap a lot with the way how Helen and Newton worked as well to make the experience of nature very intimate to even the large-scale problems. They become so much embedded in a more intimate human response. You make it also very much with art, inspirational. You touch emotions, human emotions. So in fact, on one hand, you almost see that your installations remind of cabinets of curiosities, but they are not really cabinets of curiosities. They are something a little bit more, the way how you present not just abstract nature in terms of systematizing it, but also the way how it is endangered and what needs to be done. So it really invites conversation, what could be done in terms of preserving and what we can do as humans together as a community. So you have this very strong communal aspect of work, which is precious, that you engage on the multiple levels, multi-generational family, but also really educating the future generations on kind of your, perhaps it's not a huge scale, it's a communal scale, but in fact, it's changing perceptions, the way people see through drawing. So David Haley was pointing out online that really important, the way of seeing is developed through the way you engage drawing and those workshop techniques.
Yeah.
Make yourself visible.
Yeah. I think Kathy wants to make a comment.
Hi, Brandon. We spoke last year, and I know you've been to Ireland once. Just in the last few weeks, Brandon, I've been asked to advise on 3 wetland projects in Ireland and think about art and community education. So I'm sort of just publicly announcing I'll be emailing you, because I think there might be some nice connections, even though we may not visit and physically. I just think that I'm really excited about the education part as well. So thank you so much, Brandon.
Oh, yeah, thank you. I look forward to being in touch.
I think Anne has a question written down in the chat.
It's Chris, actually. So, yeah, Chris, do you want to?
No, it's just that in some of the curators' essays in publications of yours, and I'm thinking particularly of the work at the Henry Moore Foundation at the Yorkshire Sculpture Park. They kind of pigeonhole your work with groups of people as kind of education and outreach, and somehow it doesn't feel like that's the way you see it, but somehow it's a convenient box for the curators to put it in. And in a way, it's come through so clearly in what you've talked about. But I just wondered if you wanted to chew on that for a moment.
Sure. I mean, I think you're right. It's one of the easiest ways to describe it. for folks to write about externally because they're not as embedded. I think it's much more of an exchange. I mean, there's an educational standpoint, but I've learned for years of how much more I'm learning from the participants, you know, and just trying to stop and listen. One example that's amazing is I showed you the slide in Pointe-aux-Chenes. These are the people from the United Homa Nation that are living in the wetlands. And this tribal elder was, you know, I was showing him all the specimens, and I had a sawfish bill. And he looked at it, he said, "Oh, it's so little. When I was a child, my father would catch these huge ones." You know, and I didn't really believe them. Honestly, I didn't believe, because they're critically endangered. They're so rare. And to think that they were swimming up in these muddy bayous, you know, that they were foraging up there, just didn't seem like a possibility. Then he described how his father caught a huge one and it gave live birth on the boat in a sac, in a placental sac. He described it. Not many biologists know that happens. So he had that experience in his life, and it completely changed my perception of that environment, and also what it could be again, you know, to think that it could come back, because now they're protected. And there's a lot of restoration effort that's happening in South Louisiana with the diversions. And so, I mean, I love the idea that someday they could come back so his grandchildren or great-grandchildren would once again be able to see them. So anyway, so yes, Dave, I think it's, Chris, it sometimes gets very simplified. And, you know, and then it's a little bit what Newton was saying. It's like you do something at one moment in history and then you learn from it. So you talk about it differently. I know I talk about it differently now, 10 or 15 years later than I did back then, you know?
Yeah, I just have a quick thing about your response about Cabinet of Curiosities. I think a lot of work being done in this area is using the aesthetics of the Age of Wonder, but it's real science.
Yeah.
And I think that is, it's bringing wonderment back to science.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, absolutely. And I think,
Brandon, are you working with the dead spots out there? Because I've been doing some work that myself.
We should talk about that too. That portable collapse that I showed at the end that's going on a trailer.
Yeah.
Those are all extra specimens that Tulane collected in the dead zone. And that's what I was saying. One of the interesting things is there's all this evidence that fish are changing their behavior to adapt to this dead zone. So, you know, ones that used to forage at the top, if there's not enough oxygen, they'll go to the bottom. And then those that used to be at the bottom, if there's not enough oxygen, now they're foraging at the top. So that, you know, that not only changes, you know, they're adapting to feeding in the dark to now feeding in the light, which is remarkable. And then there's other things. Some of them are breeding younger. So they're adapting so that they're reproducing at an earlier age. And some of them are switching gender. So, you know, there's all these amazing questions. But yes, I'd love to have that conversation too. And I'd love to, you know, hopefully we'll get you down here very soon, Newton, and we can go to the fish lab together. But you can meet the sheep too, meet our partners.
Okay, so Brandon, can you hear me?
Extraordinary.
Yeah, yes.
So as usual, you've depressed me very deeply. I've known you for quite a while, and as you say, your narrative has evolved. I'm reminding of the work of Drew Hemmant at Manchester, where one of his silly projects with the local children was to go attach QR codes to plants that they had identified. And then afterwards, they could go around with their cell phone asking the plant, what are you? And it was just so illuminating for the young people. Oh, is this a local plant or is this an invasive plant? Did someone plant it or did it plant itself? And anyway, but then I guess the second part of my depression is we need millions of people like you. And I'm concerned that in this workshop, we don't practice what we preach. So during lunch, I just started walking around in I think it's a garden, it's not a natural landscape, trying to figure out which were the native trees and which were the invasive trees that humans had brought. So maybe in this workshop, we should move out of this room and have the workshop in the local nature. Now, I know that complicates the hybrid online participation, but by being in this room, we're all looking at human-made things. The natural world is outside the window. So maybe this workshop, and I don't know how we do this with the online participants, but let's figure it out. How do you do nature walks in this workshop in the next 2 days?
Yeah, what a great idea. Maybe we'll do it after the workshop.
Well, no, but I mean, seriously, I mean, Newton, how do we practice what we preach? You know, how do we, this group of 30 people, look at this very local ecology, understand how it's been evolving, changing over the last thousands of years, and how, you know, what's going on here? I noticed about 6 different kinds of animals when I was walking around, lizards, et cetera, et cetera. I didn't find any snakes yet. But what is the wildlife outside of this room?
Well, how about we continue
We can all take pictures with our cell phones and bring them back.
Two more. Yes, Lillian.
I just wanted to say that you will hear quite a bit about, probably in Ruth's talk, about what's out there, because Ruth Wallen is very familiar with the area of San Diego. And I think this is what Brendan is talking about, is that it's really local. He lives there. This is his land. You know, I think that kind of scale is extremely important. That intimacy that we have been mentioning back and forth today. And I wanted to ask Brendan if have you preserved this land? Is this land preserved only, or do you own it? And the project you're doing with Newton, is that land that is going to go back to somebody else after you've done this project? Or is this something that's protected?
No, the idea is, okay, well, it's a bit complicated because there's Louisiana stuff too. So our LLC, there's an LLC, which we own, that owns the land, and a nonprofit, which then rents the land for like $1 a year, which is for the, you know, not to get too into complicated stuff, but for festivals and when we have people, you know, for liability stuff. But the land itself we're trying to get it under permanent easement.
Yes, a conservation easement.
A conservation easement, but we have to remove a certain amount of the invasive species first. So we're working, right now it's on a 3-year, like the prairie part that Newton and I are working on, there's a 3-year kind of just restoring amounts of grasses there for 3 years with the USDA. And then hopefully the plan is there's a 10-year plan, so the whole thing becomes conservation easement permanently.
Well, of course, you can't plant new plants until you've removed the invasives. So it's a process. But I'm very happy to hear that this is something that is not going to be a project that isn't ongoing. It sounds very ongoing to me. And I think that kind of commitment is what's really necessary. And oftentimes that artists don't go that route. They don't make it in their own backyard. They don't make it, you know, their conservation mark. They don't make the mark in that sort of a strong way. It's more like a demonstration, and then you go on to something else. When it's not yours, that's what happens. And so I'm really excited to hear about that. And I will come visit you.
Yeah, that would be super.
I have cousins in New Orleans, and I will come visit you. I visit them often, so I'll see you. I would love to see it.
That would be great. We'd love for you to come down and do something. You know, come and just visit and see if you get inspired.
Brandon, you know, I find that, like your prairie idea, which I'm very attracted to, I find that you have to find out how big you need the piece of prairie to behave like a prairie. Like, let me, for instance, when I first went to England, I was taken to the forest of something, and the forest of, I forget the name of it, but the forest happened to be 5 acres of trees spread out among each other with no ground plane.
Very much so.
And they thought that was a forest.
Yeah.
So so when I'm looking at your piece of, I think you need about 200 or 300 acres. And the question one would have is, can you get to the legislature to do this? Because if you were to get the 200 or 300 acres, then you would have, I would think you would have critical mass. Critical mass would then start attracting somewhat larger species, and there would be many who would more make their home. Also, a couple hundred acres would then start attracting more acres. And it's in that sense that I think you could have a very powerful statement that would reverberate back into the work with the prairies that Wes is doing up near on Turner's land. And so I think that you have a possibility of grouping and clustering here in a new way. And is there some way to get to the legislature? Because I mean, that a lot of that land can't be more than a couple thousand an acre. So even 5,000 an acre, like 100 acres would be $500,000.
Can I borrow $500,000?
What's that?
Can I borrow $500,000, Newton?
Well, whatever it costs, you know what I'm saying?
No, it's accessible, and there's two things based on that. I presented to the Louisiana State Senate Natural Resource Committee. They're very open, and I've talked to them about the missing fish, and we've had senators come out to visit the land project that we're doing here. So a really great thing about Louisiana is there's a lot of accessibility. We don't have a large population, and our population is shrinking. So you can reach government. However, at this moment in history, conservation or talking about why land is important is a little bit out of the periphery right now, because they're still thinking about how do I afford to pay the salaries of, like we are having major economic issues. I mean, the oil and gas industry is leaving. So I'm working with a whole group on how we can shift over to do ecotourism, statewide. And I think that should be part of the conversation, but it's just, it's growing perception, I guess, helping to grow or get people inspired to want to protect. And I think we'll get there. And I think it's possible to get 50 acres, 200 acres, 1,000 acres at some point, but it's going to take a little while.
There's lots of ways it can be approached. It doesn't have to be with government. It can be public-private combinations. Sure. I do a lot of work in preservation in my area. We happen to be lucky that we have a 2% tax on everything. That means that the government can then buy various different areas. But there's lots of different ways. I'd be happy to talk to you a little bit about it. And I wanted to just say in response to, I have 15 years of experience doing this with the Land Preservation Committee, but it is also Newton's suggestion is really important to think about critical mass. But in this day and age, it has been proven that what we call green necklace, lots of little areas can also be incredible habitat for things to go from, place to place and still have a very healthy life cycle. And you don't need a gigantic piece of land, which is, I might add, harder and harder to get those big pieces. But the little pieces are there everywhere. And the little people who have, possibilities of being part of a community project, either with a
Our next presenter is Judith Hersko, and I would like to introduce her to you. Judith is an installation artist who works in the intersection of art and science. She collaborates with scientists on visualizing climate change science through art and narrative. Her work is rooted in extensive research as well, and in a playful exploration of materials and phenomena of light, shadow, and transparency. Her current practice involves storytelling through performances that incorporate the objects she makes. Hersko's work has received national as well as international recognition. In 1997, she presented in her native Hungary at the Venice Biennale. In 2007, her work was featured in Weather Report Art and Climate Change, curated by Lucy Lippard for the Boulder Museum of Contemporary Art. In 2008, she received the National Science Foundation Antarctic Artists and Writers Grant and spent 6 weeks in Antarctica working with scientists. She has presented extensively on this work at universities and museums and symposia around the world, and she has published several articles and book chapters, including the forthcoming book edited by Greg Meatman, Robert Amat, and Marco Armero, Remains of the Anthropocenes. Thank you, Judith. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you also Tatiana and Heath and Sasha and everyone else involved in organizing this event and inviting and hosting us. When reading the introduction to the Harrison's Force Majeure series, I was struck by how in reflecting on decades of projects, they discovered, and I quote, that something was missing in the majority of our work, and that the salient feature in our work happened to be the absence of something, end quote. No matter how large and comprehensive a project might be, something is always elusive, since no single element, project, etc., can fix a system or web that is ailing. The cultural dominance of Enlightenment thinking that favors the destructive act of analysis, that is picking things apart, is partially at the root of this problem. This conundrum involving the limitations of our thinking is part of what I will reflect on today, in addition to other topics addressed earlier in this symposium, such as doing things with words, scales of time and space, the need for empathy with humans and non-humans alike, and much more. Instead of talking about these things directly, I will present a story. This is a first sketch based on my research for Mosaic Oceans, a project that I'm collaborating on with Dr. Jules Jaffe of Scripps Institution of Oceanography and Dr. Melody Zhu, professor of literature at UC Santa Barbara. The image I'm sharing here is from the Jaffe lab. Can you all see that on the screen? Is that all there? Okay, great. So what I ask of you for the next 20 minutes is to glue your eyes to the screen in the room, as the images are synchronized to the text that I will present, and it only makes sense if you see the image and hear the text together. May 26, 1939. Dear Dr. Kopp, I was referred to you by Dr. Dennis Llewellyn Fox. Oops, my apologies. Dennis Llewellyn Fox, who I had the privilege of meeting last week at an Explorers Club gathering. We had a splendid conversation about his work investigating color in the animal world. Dr. Fox is visiting New York on account of his recent Rockefeller Fellowship and is using this occasion to raise awareness about the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, or SIO for short. He recounted that recently this institution, entirely devoted to marine research, published a report outlining its activities in the past 5 years, as well as its plans for the future. To take advantage of its excellent staff engaged in diverse areas of oceanography and its state-of-the-art laboratories, SIO is proposing to turn to the study of large-scale oceanographic problems, which will require systematic data from the sea. Dr. Fox showed me pictures taken by you of the 104-foot Scripps acquired last year. He explained how this new vessel will facilitate SIO's explorations at sea and expand its programs. It was in the context of this conversation that he mentioned your work with diatoms. And now I have arrived at the reason for my letter. But first, let me introduce myself. My name is Anna Schwartz. I was born 1920 in Budapest, Hungary. When I turned 12, I received a box camera for my birthday. My first photograph was published in a newspaper, and by age 15, I had developed an obsession with phenomena of light, shadow, and transparency. I'm also an avid naturalist, and I've always admired women scientists as well as adventurers such as Maria Sibylla Merian, who was the first person to observe and document the metamorphosis of butterflies, and who voyaged from Amsterdam to Suriname in 1699 to search for exotic caterpillars. Another hero of mine is Jeanne Barré, who was the first woman known to circumnavigate the globe in 1776, disguised as a male valet and botanical assistant to Philibert Commerson, physician and royal naturalist on Louis Antoine de Bougainville's voyage around the earth. Incidentally, it was most likely Jeanne, disguised as Jean, who, when in Brazil, discovered my favorite plant that was later named after Captain Bougainville. In the summer of 1935, I was vacationing and taking pictures in the Hungarian countryside when I made the most unexpected acquaintance. Peter Markham Scott traveled to Hungary that summer to bring new inhabitants to the lighthouse on the Wash, where he has recently moved and where he lives surrounded by wildfowl that he has collected from around the world. Indeed, he returned from Hungary with 15 live geese in crates. Peter Scott not only lives with fowl, but he draws and paints them as well. He's an accomplished artist in addition to being a naturalist, thereby sharing some of my interests. He told me about his famous parents, the explorer Robert Falcon Scott, whom I'm sure you have heard about. However, you may not know that his wife, Kathleen, is an accomplished sculptor. In 1910, Kathleen Scott had accompanied her husband to New Zealand before he set sail to Antarctica. And after he perished in 1912, she secured the commission to create the commemorative statue erected in London and later in Christchurch. Before I digress too much, what I really need to tell you is that Peter Scott invited me to visit him in England, and to entice me, he told me about the remarkable scientific reports of the HMS Challenger. I'm sure you're already familiar with this first global marine expedition organized and funded by the British Royal Society with the purpose to examine the deep sea floor and answer comprehensive questions about the ocean environment. Based on Peter's account, I determined that I had to see the Challenger manuscripts firsthand. And I traveled to London in 1937. I saw disappointingly little of Peter, but on the other hand, I had ample time to pore over the pages of the Challenger report. And this is how I first discovered the microorganisms that have come to enthrall me. The enchanting shapes of diatoms, as well as their adaptation to such varied environments, fascinate me. And I understand that while individually minute, their collective contribution is colossal in the life of the oceans. I was similarly gripped by the sea angel and the sea butterfly. The Limacina helicina, or sea butterfly, is a shelled planktonic snail that is abundant in the southern oceans, together with its predator, the Cleona antarctica, or sea angel. The Limacina helicina is the sole food source of the Cleona antarctica, and thus their existence is intricately linked. The symbiosis of these organisms, as well as their transparency, captivate me. And I want to be the first one to photograph the light coming through their bodies and shells. This is why I have crossed the ocean to visit my cousin, Evelyn Schwartz, who was born and raised in New York. Evelyn is involved in a burgeoning relationship with Wilhelm Stephenson, the famous and controversial polar explorer. Currently, Stephenson is the president of the Explorers Club, and he holds some of the club meetings at Evelyn's favorite haunt, Romany Marie's restaurant in Greenwich Village. This is where I met Dr. Fox last week. I was thrilled to learn from him about a woman scientist who's studying some of the exact organisms that captivate me. I have so many questions that I don't know where to start. Are you familiar with the book, The Depth of the Ocean by John Murray and Johann Hjort? In it, they say that oceanography is a patiently put together mosaic representation of the discoveries made from time to time by sinking instruments and appliances into the deep and bringing to the surface material for examination and study. As someone who's involved in sampling, I would love to know what you think. Please tell me everything about how you collect specimens, what you see under the microscope, and how you represent what you see. I hope you forgive the length of this letter as well as the multitude of inquiries. Sincerely, Anna Schwartz. August 20, 1939. Dear Anna, thank you for your letter and my sincere apologies for the delay. I've been very busy with my book and I wanted to respond thoughtfully to your inquiries. Since you so graciously recounted elements of your life, I will share some of my history. I was born in Neola, Iowa on Easter Day, March 30, 1904. My father, Joseph, was a contractor and we moved to Whittier, California in 1910 when I was 6. I attended Whittier College, where I received my bachelor's degree in 1926, followed by a master's degree in zoology from the University of California, Berkeley in 1928. That same year, I moved to La Jolla to begin my doctoral research and rented one of the staff cottages on campus, together with my longtime friend, Dorothy Rosenberry. Right away, I began assisting my doctoral advisor, Winfried Emery Allen, with his plankton research. I published several papers on the subject, and in 1934, I received my PhD in biological oceanography. Since then, I have worked as an associate oceanographer and instructor at SIO, where I am the only woman scientist. The other women work as secretaries and librarians. Currently, I'm completing a comprehensive book on the marine plankton diatoms of the west coast of North America. Returning to your letter, I was excited to hear about your acquaintance with Peter Scott. While very young in 1912, I've always been fascinated by polar exploration. I had the pleasure of visiting the South Pole ship of Admiral Byrd just a few years ago. On a much smaller scale, our new ship, the EW Scripps, that Dr. Fox described to you, facilitates exploration far beyond our immediate coast, which is thrilling. Yet, some of our most valuable investigations take place close to home. The Scripps institution has a pier that was completed in 1916, and Dr. Allen has been collecting samples there for about 20 years. I guess when we think of exploring the vast ocean, the metaphor of mosaic makes sense. But it occurred to me that we can only perceive and comprehend mosaics from the proper perspective. When viewing individual building blocks in isolation, the image falls apart. This reminds me of Dr. Ritter's words when Scripps Institution for Biological Research was inaugurated in 1916. Woven through his speech titled what the Scripps institution is trying to do is a consistent plea for a holistic understanding of the web of existence. He identifies with Alexander von Humboldt, who described the intellectual and emotional impact of nature on humans as equally significant. And he quotes Humboldt, who stated that this impact arises from a presentiment of the order and harmony pervading the whole universe, as also seen in the never-failing unity within the infinite variety of nature. Dr. Ritter warns against the limitations of isolated laboratory science and analysis, making a case for synthesis and the burgeoning field of ecology. He urges scientists in this nascent institution to pursue an enlarged and ideal science lived chiefly outside of and beyond the narrow walls of laboratory, library, museum, and lecture room. Though, he adds, the institution, as well as science at large, must admit to its limiting conditions. In order to live healthily and grow strongly, it must live in both the small here and the vast yonder. My focus has been chiefly located in the small here. I sit in the laboratory most of the time and analyze the collected specimens from the vast yonder. My forte is close and precise observation, although I also help with the collection. I keep notebooks with copious records of each haul, and we adhere to strict methods that standardize measurements and documentation as well. However, ultimately, how we observe and record the natural conditions is up to the power of our senses and the adequacy of our words. The process of monitoring the peer population reminds me of film frames that unfold in time rather than a mosaic that unfolds in space. Dr. Allen is working on articles that cover 20 years of research where he grapples with the complexity of measuring, understanding, and representing natural phenomena with so many variables involved. We attempt to visualize our findings with charts that incorporate several dimensions. They are circular, divided into units of time. The circles emanating from the center represent ever larger numbers of organisms as they expand outward, and the different kinds of lines that circle around the chart depict different locations. One chart represents the 20-year average catches of armored dinoflagellates at two locations, La Jolla Pier and Port Hueneme, showing an overall trend toward higher abundance of these organisms in the summer during lunar months 5, 6, and 7. In another chart, we depict 20-year averages of one single organism to illustrate that its peak abundance occurs at slightly different times at the two locations measured. During these 20 years, the Serratium furca peaked in lunar months 4 and 5 at La Jolla Pier and in lunar month 7 at Port Hueneme. In a third chart, we have divided the circle into 20 slots to show that the yearly fluctuation of a single organism, Prorocentrum micans, over 20 years at both locations. I realize that this letter is growing lengthy, and I'm afraid I've bored you with the details. Before I close, I wanted to tell you that the general consensus is that with organisms as delicate and tiny as diatoms, line drawings provide better representation than photographs. Although for my book, I'm working with both. My secret passion is photography, and I can't wait to ask you about this craft in the future. But I better get this off before more days pass and you think I'm ignoring your communication. I'm enclosing a few copies of my drawings, as well as some charts and personal photographs. Sincerely, Easter Cup. November 7, 1939. Dear Easter, I was so happy to receive your package with all the exciting materials. You inspired me to explore new ways to work with line and light, or I should say point and light. I have taken some of your drawings and redrew them with pinpricks. On one side, these pricks appear as tiny holes that add up to lines, while on the other side, they raise the paper, creating minuscule hills that catch the light quite sculpturally. I'm sending some initial photos here. I took the liberty to apply the same process to one of your photographs of Dorothy, the one where she looks into that handheld mirror. I don't know that it works as well for a shaded photograph as it does for the line drawings, but I got an unexpected effect when I packed the transparency. The raised surface of the transparency looks like so many tiny water bubbles creating the image. I also made a collage dedicated to you. It is called Self-Portrait with Diatoms, and I will send it to you soon. I was inspired to play with pictures in this way after one of Peter Scott's friends, Emma, introduced me to the tradition of album making that thrived in 19th century England. And I realized that women of the Victorian era had effectively invented the photo collage. These albums were self-representations made for an audience of friends and family. They were often displayed in the parlor so people could leaf through them, while sometimes a more intimate version was reserved for a closer circle. My collage is decidedly less colorful, but I think you will understand the inspiration later. I just hope you like it. Thank you for sending a copy of Dr. Ritter's speech. I was struck by his overall embrace of the emotional and mystical elements of nature. For example, when he says that the tendency of man toward mysticism appears to be as natural and powerful as his tendency toward sensuousness and materialism. This made me think of an interesting and unknown artist I heard about in London. She's a classically trained painter from Sweden named Hilma af Klint. I've not seen her work personally, but Emma, who's involved with anthroposophy, met her and saw her work at the 1928 Spiritual Conference in London. Apparently, af Klint took the boat across the channel with her companion, Thomasine Anderson, and arrived in London with some of her large paintings representing the human life cycle. Emma told me that af Klint's work had always explored the natural world, but in 1906, her approach took a turn. At age 44, she began painting abstract images that investigate the forces behind perceived reality. Although her inspiration arises from spiritual practice, she very much pays attention to the discoveries of science. And there is a striking echo in her work of the presentiment of order and harmony pervading the entire new universe, described by Humboldt and quoted by Dr. Ritter. Af Klint's work also engages with the powerful effect exercised by nature that Humboldt claims springs, as it were, from the connection and unity of the impressions and emotions produced that can only be traced by analyzing the individuality of objects and the diversity of forces. Af Klint's series on flowers, lichens, and mosses is a systematic exploration of the plant kingdom that combines a diagram with the plant's Latin name, the date of investigation, and properties such as joy, humility, and devotion, which one can attempt to connect with by contemplating the plant in question. My dear friend, I'm afraid I will have to end this letter abruptly, as the most unbelievable events have unfolded recently. At the last Explorers Club meeting, I sat next to Ruth Hampton, who oversees the recruitment for Admiral Byrd's third Antarctic expedition. The man lined up for the job of recording scientific data through photography and typing fell ill, and the expedition needs someone immediately. I received high recommendation from Stephenson, and miraculously, I got the job. It's not going to be easy, as I must disguise myself as a man. We're sailing in a few days. Wish me good luck, and I wish you the same. Anna Schwartz. Thank you.
Judith, I have a question. I was thinking as you were performing this a lot about the relatively recent biography called A Secret Sisterhood that goes into the correspondences of women authors whose letters were not really taken seriously, like the friendship between Virginia Woolf and Catherine Mansfield and a bunch of late 1800 and early 1900 authors. And I was thinking, as you were doing this, about the same kind of lack, perhaps, of interest in the biographies of women scientists, that we know a lot about great male physicists, but maybe perhaps I can think of the specific turns of events in Richard Feynman's life, for instance. So I'm curious about the kind of feminist aspects of science and art, how that works in your mind.
Well, it's big on my mind, and it's been part of my work for a while. So I've been working with women scientists, and I've been including in all of my work in the last years these kinds of biographies. And I think there is more recently interest as you find the publication of books on women authors. There is more and more interest on this topic as well. And I think there are. When I was in Antarctica, I found a book that did address, first book addressed women scientists who only began to be able to go to Antarctica in the 60s. Until then, no women made it there as scientists, possibly as, well, not even as wives. Women couldn't really travel on those ships. So, I've looked into the history of women in exploration and science. So that is certainly part of this work as well. The unseen work of women and the unseen work of microorganisms.
There are a couple of comments in the chat for you, Judith, from David Haley, who is fascinated with diatoms. I'm not sure if David wants to say anything right now.
It was just very briefly, in the past couple of years, I've been working with two wonderful women curators at the Liverpool Museum of the World. Only Liverpool could have a museum of the world. But in their botany department, they have one of the most amazing collections of pressed plants. Some of them dating back to the first visits to Australia and so on. I took a group of community people from a small town in the Lake District who started with me a project called Pressing Concerns, which was looking at the difference between the number of species along the riverbanks now compared with the 19th century, where we found a book in their local archive of pressed flowers made over a 5-year period by the daughter of a local mill owner for her servant. So the gift of this pressed flower book that took 5 years to make, I wanted to discover the culture behind pressing flowers that then became a science and holds together. But out of that emerged the whole issues of diatoms, which are now fascinate me amazingly. So thank you very, very much for your story.
Thank you.